Okay, we are back. Welcome again to another episode of what we've initially started calling Undue Influence in General Conference, or more specifically, looking at themes of undue influence. Other people may call it psychological manipulation or control. Just what type of messaging, themes, and ideas that we can find in the statements of the brethren of the church, whether it's in General Conference or in other talks that they're giving. With us again is author Luna Lindsey, who we've had as a great contributor to this series in the past. How are you doing today, Luna?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm really excited about today's talk. And that is because if you've been paying attention in Mormonism, you know that we have a new prophet. Russell M. Nelson took the reins of the church earlier this year. And we've really kind of been waiting to see what type of tone he is going to set, because each prophet is different. Each prophet brings a unique set of experiences. And we're just now starting to see what the theme or the message of the new prophet Russell M. Nelson is. And that brings us to this talk. By way of background, this was advertised initially before before Thomas Monson passed away, as part of the face-to-face series of talks. It was announced that there was going to be a face-to-face with Russell M. Nelson and his wife Wendy, where their grandchildren were going to be given the opportunity to submit questions, and we would be able to watch live as Elder Nelson at the time would answer it. And when Monson passed, that was put on hold. They said, we're going to reschedule a similar event. And what ended up happening was that the prophet Nelson, his wife Wendy, came to Las Vegas and gave a special face-to-face just locally with young adults and youth in the Las Vegas area. They had the chapel he was going to be at, and then several satellite chapels. And this is the talk that proceeded. So with that background, let's go ahead and dive right in. Just to let you know, this talk was not published publicly. The text of it was not produced. The only way that anyone outside of the buildings that it was in would know about what he talked about was the short excerpts that the church released on its website. And it talked about just very vague milquetoast type themes that that Elder Nelson would have talked about: how to avoid sin, how to live your life right. But there was a gentleman by the name of New Name Noah. His real name is Mike Norton. He's the individual that went and recorded all of the secret temple ceremonies. He attended one of the chapels that the footage was broadcast to, and he pulled out his phone and turned on Facebook Live and filmed it live so that people on the internet, if they knew where his feed was located, could actually view and listen to the words of the prophets. And so I obtained his permission to capture that recording, and I've done some motion tracking to try to reduce the amount of motion in it and fixing of the audio because it was barely audible. And that is where we're getting this recording. The church itself only released very short segments of the talk, and where those segments existed, I went ahead and pasted them in so you'll see the real footage, but the audio in it is a seamless, continuous audio. You're hearing the whole talk with nothing edited, no excerpts taken out or anything like that, so you can know that this is the actual talk that took place. I've watched it once and skimmed the text of it. Did you get a chance to preview it much, Luna?
All I did was read the transcript, which you very helpfully provided,
Okay.
which cut down the time, so I didn't have to watch all 20 minutes. I was able to read it much faster. So.
Okay, I'm sorry I've been talking a lot just the beginning. I wanted to get the background out of the way so that we can dive into it, because there's some interesting stuff that happens here. So let's go ahead and get started. I think I've got my thing queued up, and as usual, we'll just start listening. It's a little bit difficult to hear because of the audio quality is not source material. So I've gone ahead and hard-coded subtitles into it so we can kind of get a sense for it. At the beginning, the timing is a little bit off on the subtitles. We'll just go with it.
I'm also told that we have my internet feed, the proceedings of this conference going to many other places. Let me just tell you what I see This chapel was jammed. I don't know. People were standing because there aren't enough seats. So you folks in those other facilities can take heart with an example that happened to me some years ago now. I was at a state conference, and after I greeted a few people who wanted to shake hands, this one very pleasant lady came up and said, "Oh, Elder Nelson, I'm so happy to see you. I've been watching you on TV all these years, and now you're here in person." Then she said, "You look a lot better on TV." So you folks rejoice in those other chapels.
So just pausing it there, you can see. Go ahead.
That joke played a lot better watching the video rather than just reading the transcript.
Yes, I'd see. And the reason that the video got really good quality is because in the newsroom footage of it, they said, he started out by introducing a little bit of levity into the crowd. And I think Nelson does a great job here of really connecting with his audience. And even though it's sometimes easy to see him as a stern, the former heart surgeon, and you expect that character to be kind of stern, he really softens his image with this look. One of the things that you did see is he comments about how full the chapel is, standing room only. And what we learned, because Mike Norton went to try to film it, is that while the chapel the brethren were in was standing room only, the several other chapels that they were broadcasting it to had only a handful of people in each one. So I think, rather than say, well, that's a way to manipulate things, I think that just speaks to the fact that people want to be in the presence of the prophet. And because it's a special kind of a once in a lifetime sort of thing. I think any that's understandable.
Yep, definitely.
Okay, let's keep going.
Everyone here tonight is filled with joy, filled with faith and devotion. It's almost powerful. I know your hearts are heavy as are Wendy's and mine as we contemplate those ruthless killings in Florida this last week. I think of Elena Petty, 14-year-old Latter-day Saint, who I snuffed out by that sniper's bullet. And it's natural for you and others to say, how could God allow things like that to happen? Well, God allows us to have our agency, and men have passed laws that allow guns to go to people who shouldn't have them.
Okay, I want to pause right there to think and talk about the importance of what was just said. So this talk was on the 17th of February, 2018, and just 3 days prior, at a high school in Parkland, Florida, there was one of the deadliest school shootings that had taken place in the world up to that point, depending on when you're viewing this video. And it was, I think, on the order of 17 dead and 14 wounded. Yeah. And so this is a very timely statement by a prophet of God in the Mormon Church, because he acknowledges that when you see atrocious things like that happen, it's very natural for us to ask, well, why would God let that happen? And I think he's giving us some insight into the way Mormon theology treats the nature of evil in the world, when he says that we have our free agency. But the unique thing is, rather than speak about the agency of somebody who might choose to commit an evil act of shooting someone, he talks about the agency of lawmakers, of politicians, legislators, in creating laws which give access to guns to people who should not have them.
And that
who he says
really
should not have them.
Really surprised me. This is the most political thing that I have heard from the pulpit, aside from LGBT type things. I'm going to go with, I think, ever. I think I might be forgetting some stuff. And and very different. I would say it's a stronger stance on this issue than most politicians are taking right now. They're doing the thoughts and prayers things, and that's exactly what I was expecting him to say. Our thoughts and prayers, God lets free will, we can't do anything about it, we're so helpless. Instead, he says, no, I'm gonna hold these people accountable here. I'm going to hold the politicians accountable for now that, I didn't pick up on this when I read the talk, but as we move into the themes of the rest of the talk, which we're going to be very critical of, I think this ties into that, the sort of accountability themes that the idea of putting temptations out there. If you put temptations out there, people are going to just flock to them. I think he kind of has a valid point in this case. And I'm just really surprised that he made such an unequivocal, bold, and here's the real test: is he going to ever say this where the rest of the church membership can hear it in a public forum?
Yeah, and I think if you pay attention to different factions that exist in Mormonism, there is very much kind of the prepper Mormon who's got this apocalyptic vision that Christ is going to come, the world is going to descend on the true people Mormonism. They're going to be left to defend themselves. They're going to be the only ones with the food storage. And so everybody else around them, when society crumbles, is going to come for the Mormons because they've got the food storage and the stuff, and you got to have your arms to protect. And so there's a very strong, you combine that apocalyptic mindset with this idea that the Constitution is a divine document, inspired by God, including the Second Amendment, where that mindset is kind of like, I think, the Skousen mindset, where they believe that you should not meddle with the Constitution. And when it says that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed, that means that the government should not put any limitations on those sort of things. And so that segment of the ultra-conservative Mormonism is going to look at him making that statement and say, hold on a second there. You're making statements that you should not be coming from the prophet of God. And evidence of this, there are some web boards that are more slanted towards that mindset. There's one in particular called LDS Freedom Forum. And I went to check and see, because I released this short segment first because it was very timely, politically speaking. And they've already said, well, this just goes to prove that prophets don't know everything. So just that statement alone is alienating a segment of the ultra-conservative Mormons.
It'll be interesting to see if he has the courage to say something like this in, say, a general conference or in a press release. My bet is that he won't. He's going to continue to pander and lay low politically, like the church usually does, except for when it comes to gay people. I think it'll be interesting to see. But hey, you know what? If he gets up there and says this in a general conference or someplace like that, credit to him. I'm not only going to say bad things about President Nelson if he's going to do some good things too.
Well, on the other side of the coin, I've seen more liberal Mormons actually say thank you, and like literally like shout for joy, saying, I'm so glad that the prophet has actually come out. And I think the Mormons have been starving for these strong moral statements about things that they can believe in, other than this whole gay marriage debate. Like, let's talk about some of the other salient issues that are plaguing our society. And he's doing it. But like you said, to me, after I've seen this whole talk, this is the most controversial, most bold, most unprecedented statement. I'm looking, and I've asked with a bunch of historians, has there ever been a sitting Mormon prophet who has specifically addressed gun control legislation? And other than a few vague quotes, which are intentionally, you can't hammer it down, this is like the most explicit statement that a prophet has ever made. But when the newsroom covered this talk, they showed, as you saw there, where the good quality was, they showed a segment of his statement, but they did not include the part where he specifically addressed gun control legislation. And so we're seeing the types of messages that they want to have the outside world see, and the types of messages that they're willing to have the inside world see. And so, as you say, bring it on. Let's see what happens in general conference, because people will be paying.
I mean, politically speaking, in terms of church membership, this sort of thing could be what brings church membership back around. I mean, you've got disaffected youth, the homeland generation, which is Gen Z. These kids are not millennials anymore. That millennials are all 20s and 30s now. This could be something that brings kids back to church. So that's interesting.
Well, a lot of people have said, hold on a second. you thoughts on things and stuff, you cut it off right at that point. So clearly he says something right after that that explains it, and it's not that bad. And I think what he goes on to do, which people haven't seen until we cover this now, is actually telling about where his heart is and how he sees Mormon theology in the way that it makes sense of these types of tragedies. So let's keep going and see what he has to say.
And just think that the gospel is the gospel of second chance. Lena Petty is the arms of her Lord and her Creator, and He gives us a second chance. Born to get a second birth, we say at Christmas time. Well, John said it well when he said, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Now that's the eternal perspective that you get from our Lord and Savior. So sad as we are, happy are we for the atonement of the Lord Jesus Christ, which gives Elena another chance, and others like her. She was a Latter-day Saint. I know one other Latter-day Saint was seriously wounded, but I think she's going to make it. Well,
so some people have pointed out that they feel bad when tragic events happen like this, and when the brethren make statements about it, they focus on the in-group that was involved. This happened with some of the, I think, the terrorist bombings in Belgium, in the airport there, where there were missionaries that were hurt, and the prophet talks about how the missionary was spared, or something like that. And they say, well, 17 people died. Why are we only talking about how tragic it was that the one Mormon girl died?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very common. Anytime you have any type of insular group, they're looking specifically for how things are affecting them. And maybe that's just because that's where people in his audience can relate to. What do you make of that?
If he hadn't said the thing about practical things that our lawmakers can do, if he hadn't added that nod, if this was just a thoughts and prayers thing, it would have bothered me a lot. And that did occur to me. I'm like, he's only talking about the two Mormons that were involved in this. What about everyone else? He makes a slight nod. He says, and others, which could mean anything. That's pretty vague. I think since there is a bit of an attempt to change people's minds, maybe on the gun control issue here, relating it to someone that people can relate to, sort of an us, in the us versus them world of things, makes that more persuasive, I think, to his audience. So I'm not going to slight him too much. I do wish, just as a standard practice for speechwriters, for LDS speechwriters, if they added one sentence of something about the other victims in each of these things they address, I think it would feel a lot better overall. But in this case, I'm not going to nitpick too much over it.
For me, I think the thing that was most telling in terms of the type of manipulation that happens, it's hard to just look at one talk and see what's going on. But when you compare this talk where one of the LDS people died with the Belgian missionary bombing, I think if you look at the Thoughts on Things and Stuff video on mystical manipulation, you'll see this part that I'm talking about, where they talk about a terrorist attack that happened, but the Mormon missionaries were not killed. They were just wounded, whereas others died. Mm-hmm. And at that time, they talked about how it was such a blessing that the Lord preserved the missionaries because they're going about doing the Lord's work. Mm-hmm. And so that was given as a sign of that it's true and that the Lord is guiding his work on the earth. Whereas in an instance like this, where something tragic happens to a member of the church, you pull out a different message. And that different message is, look how the atonement can bring us peace in times of tragedy. Right. And this is where no matter what happens, it's going to be reframed in a way that reinforces the correctness or the comfort or the rightness of the church itself. Whereas,
and that's definitely going on there. And again, I guess for some reason, probably because I'm an outsider now, I'm also thinking about the outsider. So you're absolutely right that any insider hearing that, no matter what the results of the tragedy, in terms of how it relates to Mormons involved in that tragedy, it's going to be faith affirming. And that's just like any other, even when a tragedy isn't involved, that's like prayer. If you pray and you get an answer that it's true, then that's God. If you don't get an answer, then you don't have enough faith. If you do get an answer and that it's not true, then you're being tempted by Satan. So it's the same chart, that I have in my book can apply to these things too. I am concerned I think this is probably what people are upset about when people get upset, is you have these outsiders. So if you're a non-member and you hear that 2 missionaries were saved when all these other people died, then you're putting God as being a respecter of persons there in that case. He's picking and choosing who gets to survive based on their religion that they follow and how many times they prayed that week and all these other things. And it's offensive to outsiders and even hurtful if they were involved in the tragedy in some way. And so that's another thing that comes to mind with this.
I think in this case, he plays a softer side of it and a more positive side of it. And where he talks about how, and it's interesting because he talks about Christ's message of eternal life and brings things out to an eternal perspective. And I see a danger in that, I think in this instance, when we're thinking about how to make sense of a tragedy, that can be very comforting. Mm-hmm. But if you take it on the flip side of things, we've seen instances where in groups that have a more violent bent, they may take this idea that you can look at an eternal perspective where life is not as valuable here on the earth because we have this afterlife. And so if we have to commit murder, if we have to do some sort of violent action, well, that's not that bad because sense will be made in the afterlife and second chances or whatever will happen in the afterlife. Now, in Mormons history, we have some of that taking place. We have the minutes of the Council of 50 include Brigham Young making a statement about, it's easier to go to war and to kill people and baptize them for the dead afterwards than it is to try to convert them in this life. Mm-hmm. That's that same sort of theme. I think the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the concept of blood atonement, being able to save people, it has elements of this idea that from an eternal perspective, death in this world is not that big of a deal.
Yeah. And even without those extreme examples, there's the middle road of that example, which is what we see in modern times much more often, and that's what I meant earlier by thoughts and prayers. Basically, we have something bad happens, and then they say, oh, well, they're happy with Heavenly Father now, and you'll get to see them again someday. We don't have to solve, and then the subtext is, we don't have to solve this problem. We aren't going to address the actual issue. And I think that that's where, in this case, because he did actually have one sentence that addressed the actual issue, here is something concrete that we can actually do to solve this problem. That's why that was such a relief to me, because he wasn't just saying, she's happy now in the hereafter. She gets a second chance.
I can see your point. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay, let's keep looking.
Let's go on picnic. I invite you to go with me and Sister Nelson on one warm summer night. We had dinner out in our backyard. A pesky little bee buzzed around us, wishing to join us for our hot dinner. I repeatedly waved the napkin at this bee to let him know he should leave. But despite our warnings, this persistent intruder returned again and again and again. It was quickly apparent that the bee was fascinated with our butter. There it is. Doesn't that look good? We finally gave up trying to shoo him away and watched his soft landing on that gooey butter. He feasted on the butter for several minutes. He was literally gorging himself. noticed that he was no longer flitting about. Then we realized that he was no longer moving at all. He was dead. In a matter of a few minutes, we watched this energetic, healthy bee proceed from temptation to pleasure, to loss of freedom, indulgence, and then death. Ironically, surrounding him, as he wallowed in the butter, were beautiful flowers, created especially to bring joy to his life. He succumbed to a distraction that trapped him and destroyed him. So we can all learn from this parable of the bee and the butter and our summer night dinner together. Not only for our own lives, but for others too. Your ultimate safety in this life lies in never taking the first enticing step toward going where you should not go and doing what you should not do.
I probably should have paused at the end of the bee story. I thought that was interesting they had a picture because I'm a bit of an entomologist, or at least was when I was a little kid. And I was about to take him to task on bees and yellow jackets and behaviors of that, and how first of all, bees don't like butter, and I didn't think yellow jackets did either, but there's photographic proof of a yellow jacket who seems to like butter. But I looked this up, and it ruins his analogy quite a bit, because if a yellow jacket is after meat products rather than sugary products like the flowers he mentioned, that yellow jacket is taking that home to the larva yellow jackets. This bee eating this butter isn't a selfish act on the part of the bee. It might be overindulging in the butter for some chemical reaction that I don't understand. I'm not enough of an amateur entomologist to understand, but it's selfless. He's taking it back to the queen, or taking it back to the larva. So his analogy totally broke down for me. I might just really be nitpicking because I love bugs. But yeah, it was a selfless act. So I have a problem with it. There's the overarching theme too of the moral that he's teaching, so we can get to that in a minute too.
I love looking at the metaphor that's being used and picking it apart. I think I'm just playing on your concept there, right? You know? He's the prophet, and what he can say. But what we're talking about are choices that people make for themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it would be very easy to go down and say, well, we're talking about the prophet saying that his values and priorities should take precedent over any individual values and priorities. And there's phobia induction here going along with, well, if you disobey the prophet, then you're going to die. I mean, he starts off, the first choice led this bee to death. And this is where, when we talk about different themes, some of them are very closely attached to each other. So dispensation of existence, where certain people, based on their, their position relative to the group, may or may not have their existence justified. When you start talking about, well, if you don't follow the group, if you don't follow the teachings, then you're going to end up dead.
And you deserve whatever you get because
right,
of your indulgence.
Exactly. Your indulgence, all of that is the consequence, or the deserved consequence of your choices. Then it starts putting, when you have to decide as an individual, if you're inclined to make a choice other than what the leader says, now it's not simply a choice of whatever small thing it is, you're choosing between life and death. And so that starts this notion of fear. If I make the small choice, then I may find myself dead in the future. And that starts to inform all of your decisions that you may make in your life. And you're always you feel like you're in jeopardy of, if you choose the wrong thing, or if you choose something that is against what the brethren have said, that you're putting your existence in jeopardy.
Yeah, and there's that constant decision paralysis that you get from having that second guessing of yourself all the time. And he's also, it bothers me that he's projecting these motives. We can laugh about it being a bee, but that's really in effect projecting motives onto people.
Right.
If you are doing this, it must just be because you don't have any self-control and you're not following God's plan. And so it's because you're looking for those cheap thrills. And yeah, I think that's why I think maybe I was empathizing with that bee a little too much.
Well, and he talks about a progression. He says it went from temptation to pleasure to loss of freedom, indulgence, and death. And I think, this parable of the butter and the bee is very much informing members how they should view the different choices they make in their life.
Slippery slope.
So, right, exactly. And then he uses this slippery slope to make the argument that you should never even take the first step.
And I ask, how do you have free agency if there's all these slippery slopes all around? How can the doctrine of Mormonism say that you have free agency if all you have to do is, look at a sexy model or look at a bottle of beer and all of a sudden you're in the gutter with heroin needles sticking out of that to me does not describe a humanity who has been given any kind of agency whatsoever. So.
Right. And the way they set it up is so that every decision you're making is an extreme decision. And
you're either for God or you're for Satan. And there's no spectrum of black and white. And there's the reality is this full rainbow of 256 colors or millions of colors that Mormons are only allowed to see black and white, God and Satan, good and evil.
What we're going to start to see in this talk, that this is our opening salvo to, is something that his wife, Wendy Nelson, gained some notoriety in the former Mormon community when she published a book called The Not Even Once Club. And it's a children's book. It has really cute drawings on it. But it was a club of kids who were going to choose to obey the rules of the teacher or something like that and never, ever choose anything else, not even once. And if you did choose something not even one time, you couldn't be a member of the club anymore. And a lot of us thought, well, this is just Wendy Nelson taking a gospel-focused thing and just to an extreme that, is not healthy. But this is showing that President Nelson is now reformulating that concept into this, you should never take the first step. You should never. And what that's defining the world in is that the world now, to people who are following Elder Nelson, is what the brethren say is allowed and everything else. And if you're choosing something other than what the brethren say you can do, then you're in that you're in some other club. You're following some other pathway.
Yeah, and they're using God as just to reiterate this that we've talked about in other videos via sacred science. He often talks about what God would have you do. Here, these are God's commandments. But what he means, because Mormons have been conditioned to think this way, he means the brethren. So that. But for the sake of our listeners.
Yeah, I think that we repeat this every time just because some people will start this series with this video or other videos. But whenever you hear a church leader saying we have to follow God's commandments or what God says, the code speak for that is really what the brethren say. And there's a video called, by my own voice or the voice of my servants. If you look on the YouTube channel, you'll see it. And it covers how that concept is included in Scripture and the way the brethren impose their views on the members. So let's see where he goes with this. There was one other aspect about it. He talks about making choices for our own bodies and for others too, and that safety lies in never taking the first enticing step towards going where you should not go and doing what you should not do. And we'll see where he takes that theme.
All right.
So I fast forward. I went back to the butter. So let's see where we are.
Flowers, created especially to bring joy to this. Learn from this parable of the bee and the butter and our summer night dinner together. And it's in never taking the first enticing step toward going where you should not go and doing what you should not do. Our divine creators provided each one of you with your own body. It's your own personal temple. It's a temple to house your immortal spirit, that spirit that had that beginning in that premortal realm. Sister Nelson thinks there were DVDs made on that. I don't know. But I do know that you existed as premortal spirits. And now you have come to earth, and that marvelous immortal spirit has that tabernacle of flesh, your very own house of the Lord. I love the study about the human body. I've learned that it can protect itself.
We stop. Yeah, this is some doublespeak here, because supposedly it's your own body, but it isn't really. It's still God's body. You still aren't allowed to use your body the way that you would choose to use your body. Of course, my value system is very different. I draw the line at consent. If everyone's consenting and capable of consent, probably should try not to hurt yourself. Probably should try to think things through and make sure that, you're not taking in any kind of chemicals or doing anything that you might risk your disease or your health, up to and including bungee jumping and things that don't have anything to do with Mormon sin. That's where I say I have freedom to use my body as I want. I can get tattoos. I can, use marijuana or alcohol or smoke a cigarette if I think it through and choose to do that. And I think as long as I'm not hurting anyone, that's okay. And to me, that's what freedom means. When he says that God gave you a body in context, like he's using it here, but if you eat all the butter, you are going to die. That's not really freedom. And so there's doublespeak here. You've got freedom to this glorious gift that you have, and you have freedom, but you don't really have freedom. It's God's body.
I think it's interesting how he starts out with his parable, and then he ties things directly after that into talking about some Mormon theology, metaphysical theology, that they don't cover too much in terms of the reality of the premortal existence. Mm-hmm. And I think this has been a touchy subject for the prophets recently, just because for many decades within the church, when you talked about the premortal existence, you had to also talk about the war in heaven and the fact that there were people that followed Jesus and people that followed Satan, and then people that were kind of on the fence. And the people that were on the fence were the ones that ended up being born as minorities, as Black people in other countries. These are all the result of things that prior prophets had said. And so I've got the sense that we've shied away from focusing on that concept because it's kind of part of the dark, shady past. But Nelson is bringing this back into the discussion, which I think is good. It's reaffirming some of the special parts of Mormon theology and doctrine. Mormonism has prided itself on being able to explain the question of where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going. And that's part of that narrative. As we'll see, he uses that just to reinforce the idea that our body is a tabernacle or a container for our spirit. I did find it interesting that he used it, that it's a house of the Lord. And the reason that I found that interesting, I appreciate your point, and I agree that the idea that then your body is not your own, it's the house of the Lord, is one way to look at it. The conventional Christian way to look at it actually is a way that invalidates Mormon temples, because they look at the scriptures in the New Testament that talk about your body being the house of the Lord as saying that now the Lord can come and inhabit your heart, a temple that hands have not built. And you can have direct communion with God that does not require you to go through a priestly class in the temple to offer sacrifices for you, because Jesus Christ himself was the last high priest. The veil was rent in twain, and temples are no longer required for an individual to commune with God. And so conventional Christians look at Mormonism with this weird, like, why are you pulling us back into Old Testament times when we've got this direct communication with God that takes out the middleman that is so unique about Christianity?
Yeah. And I would argue that Mormonism has that, but now that you're mentioning it, it's the Holy Ghost that supposedly inhabits you when you're doing everything right. It's the spirit that you have. And you're right, communion with actual God tends to be a bit reserved for those very special spiritual moments that most people may not even have. So
yeah, and when you have this idea that there is a place on earth in the temple that is God's house, and your access to God's house and that most intimate connection with God is controlled by the gatekeeper of the bishop and the stake president, who have to have a behind the doors closed worthiness interview, and you have to pass those check boxes in order to get there.
And even then, the Holy of Holies is supposedly the only place that God actually shows up anyway.
Right.
Even then, and so, even then, you do all the things and you still can't get into the Holy of Holies. So,
well, yeah, there's something to be said for that, but that ties into the notion that the men at the top have special access to God through that process. And again, that's going back to Old Testament notions. But just that idea that you cannot have real access to God unless you follow the edicts of the group is a very powerful controlling focus. That is part of when he talks about, your body is the very temple of God. That's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that Mormons have a unique doctrine of each of us being gods in embryo. So when he says it's a temple of God, he may be referring to each individual person who has the potential to become a god, just as Elohim, or the God that Mormonisms believe is God the Father, is today. And so another very unique Mormon doctrine that we don't hear them talk about that much.
Which is sad, because I'm partial to that doctrine. I think it's a really interesting doctrine, and one that I haven't fully let go of, even though I don't believe in God or any of these things. I think as a metaphor, it's a very powerful one. This idea that we have agency, we have great power at our disposal. And it's inspiring to me to think of that metaphorically, to be like, I can enact, I can make choices today that can enact great power in this world. And that, I think I got that from my Mormon upbringing. So I would like to see them talk more about, and then, alluding to the idea that everything has a spirit. That was something else that was sort of a folk belief growing up. So I'd like to see more of that. Yeah.
When I hear that message, I agree with the parts where it can be very empowering, and you can feel it's almost like you have such a big carrot in front of you that it gives you an aspirational perspective on your life. The thing that I want to step back and acknowledge is that it's kind of like, put ourselves back in, medieval times. It's like going to every peasant and saying, hey, you're going to be a king. Mm-hmm. If you do what I say, you're going to be a king. It's a very much an elitist mindset where you can make these promises about the potential of somebody if they just do what you tell them to do.
Right.
And if you tell them that they can become a god and that they can have ultimate power, they can have their own universe with planets beyond number and progeny beyond number, if they just do what you tell them to do, well, then you're giving them the ultimate carrot for them to have to jump through whatever hoops you want to put in front of them. And so on the one side of it, giving you an aspirational view towards your life, you just have to acknowledge that is also a very easy way for people to tempt and to I don't know, it's almost a seductive thing, this elitism. People want that.
With the catch, it's definitely, with that catch, as long as you do what I say, then yes, it's unempowering, it's disempowering, it's robbing me of my divinity, because a god, in theory, is a sovereign being. It is someone who doesn't get told what to do, right? I mean, not in that sort of I get to do what I want kind of way. So yeah, because I have divorced myself of the beliefs, if you do what we say, that metaphor for me as a divinity metaphor is purely self-originated. It's up to me to decide each day what ways I'm going to use my godly power. So,
all right, let's keep going.
Regulate itself. My blood sugar levels every year I watch them. Always on the mark. And amazingly, it can heal itself. Now, in order to fulfill God's great plan of happiness and allow premortal spirits the privilege of life here on earth, He has put into each of us powerful appetites. Those appetites are necessary for our physical survival.
Okay. I just want to pause here before we get into how he's going to play this. And I think this is one of the reasons that anytime you read a book on cult mind control or how these mechanisms work, they'll list, the different things that the group tries to control over the members. And almost always you'll see that one of the things that they try to control is like what types of food are appropriate to eat. And he's talking about the fact, he introduced the fact that each of us do have a physical body, and they're governed by physiology, which means that we have needs. And he'll talk a little bit about the variety of types of needs. It could be from something as simple as water, food, sustenance, to the sexual appetites that are part of our biology, to even just emotional connection and socializing that are part of the needs that we as organic individuals have. Each of those needs is an opportunity for someone to have an element of control over you by restricting how you can fill those needs. And realizing that the Jehovah's Witnesses have their own way of controlling those things, the Scientologists, the Moonies, all of them, through the various ways that they restrict what choices people can make for themselves, how they have to take the values and priorities of the group and replace their own values and priorities with the group priorities, gives you insight into, if that's how they're controlling the Jehovah's Witnesses, then there is an element of control that you have in your life as a Mormon based on the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So let's see where he goes with it.
All right.
Each of us has an appetite for food. We get hungry by the clock. And fast day, sometimes a slow day, because it's a long time before meals. We have an appetite for drink. And we have an appetite for love. Those appetites are absolutely essential for the perpetuation of our lives. So, the cunning wiles of the adversary aim to thwart God's plan. So what does the adversary do? He attacks us through our appetites. He tempts us to eat things we shouldn't eat, even the meat, to drink things we should not drink, and to love as we should not love.
It still really bugs me, that bee. I mean, it was just getting food for its family. It was a selfless act.
Okay.
I'm really hung up on that bee.
I just feel bad for the bees. He's just, for whatever choice, he wasn't choosing to die. He was choosing yummy butter. At any rate.
For his children. I looked it up. It's on Wikipedia.
Okay.
Anyway.
I just want to make sure that anyone that's watching, you need to realize that whenever a general authority invokes Satan, invokes the adversary, just realize that that is deep-rooted programming within ourselves. He embodies everything that's wrong, bad, or evil, and that immediately starts a phobia induction cycle in our mind where we want to avoid those things. Those things are evil, they're bad, and so it's very powerful in terms of persuading you to act one particular way. All that a church leader has to do is say that, well, Satan is trying to tempt you in XYZ, and so we need to do ABC. And it's very easy to fall into that mindset without giving any critical thought. Now, we've seen this happen when the brethren say, well, Satan tries to tempt people on the internet to read sources, historical sources from places other than the church. And, so you got to stay away from that. And so people who aren't thinking critically about this will say, well, then I can't read any information anywhere from any place other than church sites and sources. Mm-hmm. What he's doing here is he's using that same sort of the power of that phobia induction through invoking Satan to be able to give force to whatever he's going to say next.
Yeah,
now,
the Satan thing. Sorry, Una.
Go right ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, the Satan thing really bugs me. It's one of my biggest pet peeves whenever I hear it brought up, because it's a very convenient, invisible being that you can't prove. It's not falsifiable. I'm a lot more okay with a positive, the carrot, the God and heaven and that sort of thing, than I am with this invisible, non-falsifiable evil being. Because you can ascribe anyone's legitimate reasoning, their legitimate behaviors, their any motive that a person might have, you can just erase it all their real ways of being, you just like, oh no, you're just following the lead of Satan. You've been misled. You've been deceived by Satan. And I think it bothers me so much because it hurts real people. It dismisses and belittles and invalidates real people, of which I am one. I have had my behaviors ascribed to Satan, and it's very convenient and very easy to do. As a twist on that old saying, I believe that the greatest lie Satan ever told is that he does exist, because I think more evil has been done in the name of trying to defeat Satan than has probably been done in the name of doing good for God. It's a terribly misused concept. It's a very manipulative concept. So,
and I think that the power of this idea of invoking Satan to diffuse anything, and I love the way that you phrase it, where it's kind of easy, and it's almost a thought terminating cliche, where if I've had this in my own life where I've had close loved ones say, the work that you do is basically Satan's work or the work of the adversary, and because anything that's not helping build up the church that people would perceive as tearing down the church has to be the work of Satan. And this is reinforced with scripture. It's reinforced in the temple endowment ceremony, the thing that is so sacred they can't even talk about it. Well, part of that is Satan basically saying, if you don't live up to every commitment, every covenant, which includes basically, giving everything to the church, then you are going to be in Satan's power. And so those of us that have been through the temple, who then come to a different perspective later about the nature of the church and what it is as an organization, when they leave, not only do you have to confront the personal challenge of unplugging your mind from those concepts, then you have to deal with your loved ones who still hold to the idea that because you've made choices other than the church, you are now in Satan's power.
And it's such a pervasive idea that I've been out of the church for more than 15 years now. And I still sometimes wake up and think, what if it's Satan? What if all this stuff that I believe, even though I've sought concrete evidence for my beliefs, I've sought, I'm very nervous about believing, at least strongly believing anything that doesn't have some kind of evidence or evident benefit to me. I still wake up and think, what if somehow Satan has faked this evidence somehow? And so it's destabilizing and harmful for even those of us who want to leave it behind. I don't want anything to do with a belief in Satan anymore. And yet that belief plagues my steps.
And I think when you talk to former Jehovah's Witnesses, Satan and the phobia induction that they have in their group is even more vocal, more present than I think we see in Mormonism. And so the turmoil that they go through, they'll describe just what you did, where even years after they leave or in the process of their faith transition, they just have this fear that they've been deceived by the adversary. And that's a very powerful force, and it's hard to break. What I think is interesting here is that the prophets have now, it used to be that they could just say being gay is a sin. It's a choice of wickedness, it's a perversion, it's unnatural. Now they can't say that. And so now we are left with vague metaphors and allusions to things like appetites. Sexuality is in that category. And I think that's what we're seeing here, because he talks about these needs that our physical body has. And then he talks about how Satan used those needs to thwart the Lord's plan. And in Mormonism, the Lord's plan is for people to come to earth, to have children on the earth, to learn how to be parents, so that when they become gods, they can be just as much of a parent as God is, and that their own progeny can do the same thing in an endless cycle of gods.
Which hypersexualizes gayness, because, I mean, one of the biggest things that I opened my eyes was how, and by the way, I'm in that spectrum. I'm bi and I'm genderqueer. But what opened my eyes when I first met gay people was how human they were, and that it wasn't sex all the time, and in bathhouses and all that stuff. It was also about relationships and family and love and wanting to raise kids, and I still run into that when I'm having this sort of argument with my family. There is this assumption that the only reason that you would choose or be gay, whether you're born that way or not, is so that you could have as much sex as possible.
Right. And
No, it's about families and love, like straight people.
No, and that's what I think is interesting, because I agree with you in that most of the time historically we've heard Mormon leaders talk about homosexuality. They've always framed it in terms of unnatural sex acts. And rarely, if ever, do they actually address the fact that a gay person actually will have a full, complex, emotional, romantic, and familial relationship connection with their partner, with the object of their desire, that is beyond sex.
And that so they can date that person just like a straight person within the context of Mormonism and remain celibate until their wedding night. And this is where I think the gay marriage thing, now that it's legal and now we have examples of gay married, otherwise normal, other than the fact that they're gay, families coming up, is that it normalizes that, and it shows that, yeah, you can be gay and date someone and stay celibate until you're married. It's a concept that my family, when I talk to them about people that I know up here in Seattle who've wanted to get married or whatever, and to them, they think that they're just shacking it up. And I'm like, whoa, no, they're not. They're following all of the commandments, except they happen to have a girlfriend. And they're a girl.
That's one of the reasons I'm a little bit concerned. What we're seeing here is that now that we've got examples where there are faithful members who acknowledge that they're gay, but still want to be members of the church. And they're like, okay, you say I have to follow the law of chastity, I'll do it. But so now he's saying that one of our needs is to love, and that Satan perverts our love. So now what he's broadening the conversation to say, not only is the act of gay sex wrong, but now finding homosexual love, which may include that full spectrum of emotions, is also part of how Satan is thwarting the Lord's plan. And so we're demonizing not only the act of gay sex, but also the expression of a full love-based relationship in something other than the heteronormative Mormon way.
And denying it to gay people for their entire lives.
And so we've tied Satan now to this demonization, and make no mistake about it, he's not talking about, whether or not Mormons choose to eat at McDonald's too frequently and break the word of wisdom in that regard. This is all just flowery language to speak around the fact that he's hammering down against homosexuality. So let's keep going.
Think of that being the governor. In spite of many warnings, he took the first step toward a place he should not have gone. He ate what he should not have eaten, and he died when he could have been alive. He even refused to heed the warnings of an apostle.
Okay, I got to play that thing again, because I want to hear him say that joke and what he says afterwards, because that is
the first step toward a place he should not have gone. He ate what he should not have eaten, and he died when he could have been alive. He even refused to heed the warnings of an apostle. Stupid me.
All right.
I'm going to stretch this analogy because this be, I swear this be. So do you really think the apostle was sitting there going, you know what? God really wants that bee to live. So we're going to shoo him away from our picnic table so that he won't die, because we are more wise than that bee and we will save its life. No, they were irritated because there was a yellow jacket disturbed. That's why anyone shoos a bee away from their table, because for selfish purposes. I don't want that bee anywhere near me because it might sting me, or for fearful purposes. So maybe I'm stretching this. I think there's another side to this analogy. And that analogy is that the apostle isn't doing anything for the good of anybody else. He isn't trying to save anybody's lives by ordering people around. He's doing it out of his own fears and his own needs and his own need for control.
I love that. I love that point. What I want to focus on and what he just did was he circled back to the bee, and then he reinforced this idea that you shouldn't take the first step, because he brings up, he took the first step that resulted in him being dead when he could have been alive. So now we're doubling down on if you don't do what we say, then you're going to be dead. Then he brings out that the bee refused to heed the warnings of an apostle. So now he's reinforcing the fact that we have to obey the apostles, i.e. himself and the other apostles. And then to cap that off, he said, stupid bee. And I think that, to me, is kind of just the twisting of the dagger at the end of it, because a lot of people who unplug themselves from the church because they learn about church history, they learn about the pain and the difficulties that it causes in people's lives because of the depression, dealing with toxic perfectionism, dealing with the psychological trauma over demonization of homosexuality, or demonization even of just normal human sexual development. And they find a different way that works for them better in their life, that gives them hope, that gives them outlook that is not as bleak as what they found within the confines of the church. And it says you're stupid for doing that.
Yep. That's, I mean, it's straight up verbal abuse. I mean, it was in the context of a joke. But yeah, jokes are tricky because that can soften things that are meant to be verbal abuse. So it's really hard to say. But yeah, it's, if you called someone stupid or inferred that they were stupid, that would be belittling, and that's verbal abuse. And so I think he's definitely walking a line where plausible deniability is certainly everywhere to be had. But yeah,
I take this a little bit more because I have friends who, you know, maybe have been divorced. Their spouse remains within the church and is trying to bring their kids to church every day, and their kids then also spend time with their dad, and so they're hearing this religious leader say that their dad, who is no longer subscribing to their edicts, is stupid.
Yep.
And it's one of these small things, but it can have a powerful effect on the mind of people who are forming how they view the world.
Especially when backed up with scriptures that are quoted fairly often talking about the foolishness of men. And there are plenty of those. So.
All right, let's keep going.
Now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about things that will have a positive influence in your lives. Some positive things you can do to make your life both happy and meaningful. One of the most important things you need to learn in life is to know who you really are. Learn about your parents.
Okay, before we get into that part, the concept of knowing who you really are, I think, is very, very loaded. Like, what does that bring to your mind? What does that bring to your mind?
In the context of Mormonism, I mean, I was taught that it always came along with, remember who you were in the pre-existence, remember why you're here on earth, remember God, remember that you're a child of God, and remember this sacred path that you vowed, you know, that you would never. Saturday's Warrior stuff comes up for me. Outside of church context, without all of that loading going on, I think it's good advice. Learning who you are as a process influenced only by yourself and by the influences that you choose is a very valuable process. It's when you're doing so with the guidance of influences that you don't fully understand and you may not have chosen because maybe you were born in the church, or maybe you're a convert, but you only chose a certain amount of influence and you ended up with more influence than you were expecting. That isn't learning who you really are. That's learning someone else's vision of you. So,
yeah, I think I agree with that. When you start to pay attention of the way that they use this concept of things as they really are, like Bednar has a whole talk on things as they really are. They'll apply it to a lot of different things. They'll apply it to happiness. Well, you think you're happy, but you're not really happy unless you do this. True happiness cannot be achieved unless you do X, Y, and Z. You know, you may make choices, you may live your life and think you know who you are, but who you really are is defined by how you obey what we tell you have to obey. And it's a way of robbing you of your identity, because you may have feelings and a perspective on the world that is based on your own independent judgment and thought. But then when he tells you and reminds you, you have to look at it based on who you really are, then suddenly it ties in everything that the brethren have taught you, because they're the ones that have informed you that you are really this God in embryo that can only achieve that potential by following their edicts. And so suddenly you've got to remember, okay, who I really am is the natural man is an enemy of God. So the thoughts and feelings that I have are not an expression of who I actually am. They're an expression of this natural enemy to God that I inhabit. And so I can immediately shut those things out of my brain and transplant them with what they've told me to put in. And it's a way to deprive yourself of who you really are rather than discover who you really are.
Yeah, it's
Because
self-denial
you're not
in
given
the sense,
permission.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
self-denial in the sense that you are denying the realities of you, of the thoughts that you come up with, the senses that are yours. And it in the context of doctrine over self, when you are constantly told that the doctrine or the will of the brethren or the will of God is supersedes any of your own impulses, desires, thoughts, and feelings, that's when who you really are isn't about who you really are. It's been a lifelong process for me to learn who I really am, because I'm so full of self-doubt. And children aren't born with self-doubt. Little babies don't really have a whole lot going on there. Any self-doubt that we have is programmed by our world, by our culture. And for me, I'm constantly questioning myself. A little thought will pop up and I'm like, where did that come from? That's not me. That's, and these are habits that I learned at a really young age, learning to trust my gut instincts, learning to trust, I don't know about that person. I don't have anything real to base it on, but something about that person, I just, and I learned to deny that. Nope, that person's fine. There's nothing wrong with that person. That it's those sort of gut instincts that when I actually listen to them, I'm much better off than when I suppress them. And that's something that Mormons are regularly taught: suppress those instincts, suppress the gut feeling, because these outsiders, these outside leaders are the ones that are telling you. And the other word I wanted to touch on was pseudo-personality. And that's what cult researchers call the personality that, particularly converts, they're usually studying recruits to a cult. They had one personality before joining the cult, and then after the cult, they have a different personality, or during the cult. And that's what they call a pseudo-personality. It's sort of a hybrid. It's part you and part what the group wants you to be.
Yeah. I think that that concept, I think Steve Hassan was one that verbalized it as your cult identity and yourself, and then your normal identity. And what's interesting is they can be so compartmentalized that you could, and I think we encounter this in Mormonism when we leave the church, like I do, I can have interactions with my family and my brothers, I think my brothers in particular, where it's just like normal, just like anytime, because we're not talking about things that conflict, and they are who they are. But as soon as we talk about something where I have an opinion which may contradict something that the prophets say, then they immediately adopt whatever the prophet says. And the way that I've tried to point out that this thing happens is, I asked them early on, do you believe that homosexuality is a choice or can be the product of natural consequences? It's not a choice. And it's definitely a choice. It's a choice of wickedness. But then when I direct them to the Mormons and Gays websites and some statements that the church has come out that have acknowledged that it is not a choice born of wickedness, and then revisited them and asked them what they think about it, they say like, oh, it's not a choice. It's like it, and it's something where when you're in an indoctrinated mindset, you adopt whatever the higher authority says, and you see no contradiction. And Orwell described it as this type of doublethink where you can hold two contradictory things and it doesn't even bother you. It doesn't faze you. And I think particularly at the interrogation scene at the end of 1984, when O'Brien is trying to show this to Winston, he makes the point when he's asking him, how many fingers am I holding up? He's saying, the only answer that was right that Winston gave him was, I don't know. And that is because at any moment in time, the correct answer is whatever the party or Big Brother wants it to be. That is the correct answer.
And
so
get a
when you
little
put yourself in that mindset,
to get a little personal on that, I mean, I got out of a domestic abuse situation a couple of years ago, and where gaslighting was a primary feature of that relationship. Gaslighting being someone who's constantly questioning, doubting your perception of reality. And I was to that point. I was to the point of saying, whatever you say, just make the pain stop. And I was to the point where I doubted all of my perceptions, every one of my perceptions, just in case any of those perceptions came in conflict with his. So this is, and gaslighting is perhaps more directly painful when it comes on a personal level like that, because you're with that person day in and day out, but it is no less traumatic, I think, to occur on this larger cultural level that Mormons experience all the time. So, yeah.
So anytime you hear any of these leaders talk about who you really are, or whether you can be truly happy, or whether you can find true fulfillment, just realize that truly, really, those words are programming words that are designed to make you dependent upon them to achieve the things that we all want to achieve. Knowledge about ourselves, happiness, fulfillment, all these different things. And just that should be a red flag that goes up anytime someone else is trying to tell you who you truly are or how you can truly experience things. All right.
Grandparents and their forebears, if possible, interview them, take notes, learn about the first converts in your family. And maybe you're the first convert in your family, but write it down, write those notes down and give them to your children and grandchildren. Most importantly, know that you are an elect son or daughter of God, created in his very image. Receive your patriarchal blessing.
Before we get to the patriarchal blessing, I just want to validate what he first said about connecting with your parents, with your grandparents, and learning their story and finding some way to remember it, even if it's writing it down. I think now do an interview while you record with your phone and keep it on YouTube so that even your posterity can have. I think that those ways of connecting with your family and learning the story of your family are very valuable. And I've always loved that that's been a part of Mormonism's culture. And I think that is something that I still hope to preserve in my own life.
I agree. And it's something that I value more the older I get and the older my parents get. The more, and especially given the sharp divides that we've had for so long, given that they're still in the church. It's something that I've put a tremendous effort in the last few years to try to bridge those gaps enough so that I can get to know my parents more than I have. So. And
I struggle with my daughters are like, stop taking video, Dad, stop taking pictures, just live life. And I'm just like, but I want to remember. And like, I remember what it was like not to be able to just pull out a camera and do things. And now, like, you can't see any video of me when I was a kid. Okay, here we go.
I learned from it. An inspired patriarch will declare your lineage, giving you some idea of your connection to God's covenants made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and others of the house of Israel. Learn what it really means to be known as children of the covenant. Have you ever watched your mom and dad, or maybe yourself, do your family history, and you see those initials, BIC, born in the covenant? What does that really mean?
Okay, so he's talking about patriarchal blessings. And one of the things that, if you're not Mormon, you will understand about Mormonism is that when you come of age around age 15 or 16, you have the opportunity to go and visit a patriarch who's usually an elderly gentleman who has a special calling where he will give you a blessing that places you in one of the houses of Israel and then prognosticates a little bit on your life. He may tell you things that you can look for in your life, things you can hope for, the era at which you might die, and then he'll proclaim that you can come forth in a particular resurrection. It's almost like, if you take the religious elements out of it, it's almost like a fortune teller sort of thing about your life. And it has the same effect where in times of doubt or question or crossroads in your life, you may pull out this patriarchal blessing, try to extract meaning from it, and use that to inform the decisions that you make. And our minds are built to make these connections. And so we may look at it just like if you're reading the predictions of Nostradamus and say, oh, this said I was going to do this, and I did something very similar to that. And so it reinforces the idea that what they tell you is real. Now, with that as a background, I want to revisit again the idea that he's talking about being a child of the covenant, being born in the covenant, and they're referring to promises that were made to the patriarch Abraham from God. And placing you in the house of Israel places you in that lineage. And when he says you need to know who you truly are and read your patriarchal blessing, and that you may have been born in the covenant, this is alluding to the idea that your identity is captured by the group. And when I say it's captured by the group, what that is telling you is that your ability to connect with God is something only made possible by the position the church has granted you by putting you in that lineage. Because if you aren't in that lineage, then you are not going to be one of the beneficiaries of the promises given to Abraham, which are all of these blessings of God. If you're not in the covenant group, you're in the out group. So we've got the us versus them thinking. We've got the dispensation of existence where your identity is only valid so long as you're in the group. And all of these things work to keep you tied and bound to the group and to view the world only in relation to how your standing with the group is.
There's elitism too. You have this lineage, this connection to the biblical prophets. To I think he said something else that was elitist in the previous clip. I forgot quite what it was. Born in the covenant, this special. You have a specialness as long as you're in the church, and as soon as you're out, if none of it's true, then you're not special anymore. You're just like one of the 7 other billion people in the world.
Yeah, and this is something where to dig into the kind of the weeds of it, I think there's some quotes from, I think it's Brigham Young or one of the earlier prophets, where they actually made the statement that your blood is transformed, so it actually becomes a literal like genetic blood descendant of Abraham based on what house that you're a descendant of. And there's some other unique little corners of Mormon doctrine where, you know, if you're a descendant, a literal house of Levi or I think it's Levi, if you go into a ward, you instantly become the bishop of that ward. And there's just like all sorts of really esoteric things that are fun to explore, but aren't really relevant to this discussion. So let's keep going.
Well, the patriarch will also declare something of your future, both here and in the next world. Live to be worthy of your patriarchal blessing.
I want to point out there's 2 things that he just did there, returning to the sort of fortune cookie idea of patriarchal blessings. Number 1, it covers this life and the next. So we often hear that about patriarchal blessings. Well, especially if someone dies young or they die without this, you know, great prediction coming true for them, it's like, oh, well, that's supposed to occur in the next life. And the other catch here is that you have to be worthy. So it's not just a blessing freely given. There are conditions attached to it. And so if that impossible promise that you're given never happens, it must be your fault. And so blame reversal occurs.
I see. All right, let's see here. I'm going to pull up. Okay, unbeknownst to me, we actually have an audience, and people have been watching this. So I forgot to make it private.
Hi, guys.
Hello, viewers. Okay, I'm just going to go through and see if there have been any questions or anything.
I didn't even advertise it this time.
Yeah. Okay, we're just going to continue there. Let's go back to where the window that I'm at. Okay. Historically, I just find it entertaining that the first patriarch was I think it was Joseph Smith's father. It alludes to the biblical patriarchs. It was kind of like this separate lineage other than the prophets and apostles. And Joseph Smith's father charged money for patriarchal blessings. You had to pay him money, and it was encouraged that people would get multiple. And so it was a source of income for him.
I had no idea.
And I think Hiram Smith, as the firstborn or the eldest son, took over after his father died, and it was later that paradigm was changed.
Wow.
But there's a fascinating history about the origin of the patriarchal blessings, and not only that, but H. Michael Marquardt has done a lot of research because they recorded those early patriarchal blessings, and some of the things that were predicted in those early patriarchal blessings were just outrageous. And, there are a lot of people who are dead now who were told they were going to be alive at Christ's second coming. There were people who were told they were going to be able to fly. I think people who were told that they were going to do missions on the moon and things like that. Just a whole bunch of really outrageous things that were part of the, kind of the mythology of all the fantastic things that were happening with what Joseph Smith and the early prophets were talking about.
I'd like to see a study of... Okay.
No, go ahead. What were you saying?
Oh, I'd like to see a study of comparing patriarchal blessings. I've seen these in threads on various ex-Mormon forums, but I would like to actually see a study with preferably hundreds or even thousands of samples, if you could get that. It's awfully convenient that patriarchal blessings are secret, because like the new name you're given in the temple, which we now know is the same name given to everyone of your same gender that goes through on the same day, I want to know the process by which patriarchs deliver these blessings. And are there overlaps? Is there copying being done? Were the other 16-year-old girls that went through that week, did they get pretty similar patriarchal blessings to me, or did they get widely different ones? Are the patriarchs going off of their intuition based on the sort of demeanor of the person coming in or not? I have so many questions, and this is an area that I have not seen really talked about very much in the ex-Mormon and French Mormon communities. So
one of the things that I think is particularly effective in how these blessings can bind you to the group is that you will find in the blessings that the ambitions of your life and the greatest achievements of your life are going to be tied to the paradigm of the church. And so when you're posed with those nexuses, those crossroads of life where you're wondering what you should do, whether it's to get married to a particular person, whether it's to accept a job or something, rather than having your decisions based on your own assessment of things, based on your own internal values and judgments, you've got this external thing that is enmeshed with the expectations and demands of the church that color your decisions. And our identities are shaped by each of these small decisions in our lives. And this is just another part of how the church infiltrates our lives and turns us into something other than what we would be without it, in a way that sometimes and frequently may be directly opposed to what we would choose otherwise. Yeah. There's certainly some times where our own personal decisions and where the church would lead us are not in conflict. I wouldn't smoke, whether I was in the church or not. But there are other things in terms of, choices or ways that you view yourself or view the world that can be severely affected.
Yep, definitely.
All right, let's go.
And understand it. You've been created for a purpose, just like Sister Nelson said. Learn of your divine purpose, and then live up to it. This will come to you as you seek for it. Ask your Heavenly Father in the name of Jesus Christ how He feels about you and your mission here on the earth. If you ask with real intent, over time the Spirit will whisper His life-changing truths unto you. Record those impressions, review them often, and follow through with exactness.
It's all contingent on whether you're intent enough. If you don't get those answers, then you weren't intent enough. So He's setting you up for the victim blaming, and also the influence, what we're expecting, because the answers to prayer are so vague and so numinous. What we're expecting to hear from those answers is based on influence, whether that's influence we've chosen for ourselves or influence that's coming from outside. That's going to be reflected in those thin, quiet, still small voice whisperings that we do hear. And so it's a bit of a mystical manipulation setup here for, and by the way, I'm always careful when I do this because I think that spiritual experiences are special. And I don't want to sort of dismiss spiritual experiences that people have had, but they are influenced by our surrounding influences. So He's setting us up with mystical manipulation to, when we pray, get the same answers from the Holy Spirit that we're getting from the leaders. When we step outside of that bubble, and seek spirituality through whatever means we seek it, we tend to get different answers then. And this was one of the big, cracks in my shelf in my early 20s when I worked with a guy from India, and I asked him, how do you know the truth of Hindu? And he talked about warm feelings and spirituality and spiritual experiences. And I'm like thinking, but that's kind of how Mormons do it. It wasn't the exact same process. It wasn't Moroni 10:4, but he talked about good feelings. And I realized that these aren't unique to Mormonism. And I think that that's where it's dangerous. So.
Yeah, I think where he really captures us is at the beginning of that quote when he says, "You've been created for a purpose. Learn your divine purpose and live up to it." And what that does is that now we've framed our entire life's work according to how we subscribe to this purpose defined by the church.
Yeah.
And the way that then affects you is when you're at those key points in your life, like if you're at the cusp of adulthood, your purpose is defined by serving a mission or getting married in the temple. And so you may go and you may pray, like he says, and ask for your real purpose, but the only options that you're giving yourself are those two things that are considered acceptable choices by the church: serve a mission or get married in the temple. And so if you pray about those things and you don't get an answer that works for one of those, then you're told, well, maybe your intent wasn't pure. So you have to keep waiting until you get one of those answers.
Yep.
And so this milieu that you're in, by only defining your life according to this purpose that they've prescribed for you, is so limiting, because it deprives you of the ability to go out and find your own purpose, find a calling in your life that is one that you define for yourself on your own parameters.
Yeah. And when that ship has sailed and you're a young person, because I was that person, I was that early 20-something who made some mistakes in my late teens and wound up divorced and single mom and that whole thing. There I was doing all the right things, going to church, going to single adults activities, doing all the things. No one wanted to date me because I was used goods. And there I was, 25, looking around going, they want me to go to old single adults now because you're really old if you're 25 and you're not married yet. So neither of those two choices go on a mission. I couldn't go on a mission. I had a baby. Or go get married to someone in the temple. None of those choices were available to me. And so it hurts people who that don't fit into those, square peg into a round hole. Infertile women I've talked to who's really struggle with that. Now it's time to have babies. I can't have babies. There's a lot of people who just don't fit. It's damaging to them. Yeah.
And so for them to define your purpose without giving you the power to define your own purpose is a pretty strong component of control.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that really touched me about his talk, is that I don't know that I took Russell Nelson's as seriously before as his ability to, the density of which all of these manipulative things are packed into his talk is really high. I mean, he's talking, almost every sentence he issues is filled with this subtext of control, and I'm that's kind of why we're having to stop so much.
Yeah, one quick point too is that's sort of what the point of conditioning is if you were hearing this talk for the first time, you've never heard of Mormons, you don't know anything about Christianity or anything, and you sit down and you wouldn't have any idea. There's no buttons there to push. The thing is he's talking to people with years of seminary and Sunday school and Relief Society and priesthood, and all he has to do is say this phrase and he pushes that button. Done. It's all automated, right? So now he can move on to the next one. He doesn't have to build the whole Rube Goldberg machine. He's already got just this panel.
Oh, that's a very good point. Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going.
I promise you that when you begin to catch even a glimpse of how your Heavenly Father sees you and what He is counting on you to do for Him, your life will never be the same. Prophets of God.
Okay, I just want to refocus it. He said you have to follow it with exactness, and that's going to come back to this theme of not even once, never going down even the first step towards any path that's other than what the prophet has, and exactness. And this is a return to the very themes of toxic perfectionism, of
demand for purity,
that
inadequacy.
that Holland, in a general conference talk just a few conferences ago, was saying we can't get lost in toxic perfectionism. This is what he's doing. And later we're going to hear him say that his mentor was Spencer W. Kimball. And Spencer W. Kimball, I have a video of him on on my YouTube channel where he came out with this notion that perfection is attainable in this life, and you've just got to discipline yourself and you can become perfect by degrees. And it's that cycle which gets people completely depressed and overwhelmed with this demand of perfectionism that just is so unhealthy. But he's saying it, and he's reintroducing and reinforcing those themes.
Have been provided in each dispensation to help people to live well and to have joy. Each prophet is a unique individual. No two are alike. I'm living proof of that. They have many attributes in common. One is that each prophet understands the importance of divine law.
Just want to reinforce that he said that the prophets tell people how to live well and to have joy. And so that's, now we're in jeopardy of not living well and not having joy if we don't obey their edicts.
Yep. And that's a promise, but it's a promise they don't have to keep, because he set up all these if-then statements that are really easy to wiggle out of. If you're worthy, if you have intent, if you want it badly enough, if you have faith. And so he doesn't have to keep that promise.
And on top of that, you can have somebody who says, I'm going to tell you how to live well and to have joy. You shouldn't steal. You should be nice to people. And then he can start adding, so he'll say things that are not controversial, that everyone would agree with. But then, because he said all those things, now he can add in his own things of, you shouldn't drink tea, you shouldn't drink coffee, you shouldn't wear sleeveless tops. And all of these things.
Read anything you read on the internet.
Right. These are like arbitrary things that people are not bad people if they do, according to everybody else. But if you're in this paradigm where good and bad is defined by what comes out of these men's mouths, then suddenly you're set up to look at yourself poorly if you make choices other than that. And you're set up to look at the world around you, to look at your children and see them as less than, or see them as evil if they make choices other than what these men say. And so it affects how you see yourself and how you see the world. And that's where I think a lot of the harm comes from it.
Yeah.
The knowledge of divine law and effective righteous leadership go hand in hand.
So right there, he's sort of, he said that he said that the thing that all prophets have in common is knowledge of divine law. And then he says, what's that quote there on the screen? That knowledge of divine law and righteousness go hand in hand?
Yeah, let's see.
Should be the one that's still up there.
No, it's for...
So I can only hold one thought.
The knowledge of divine law and effective righteous leadership go hand in hand.
Yeah. So he's basically just saying that he's a righteous leader, which... That's one of those things.
Saying that he is a righteous leader, he's setting up his own criteria for defining himself as a righteous leader,
as an authority, and an authority that you can't question, who's more righteous than you are. And this is how, when people say, they point to the prophet and they say, well, the prophet is these things, and then the prophet says, or someone defending the prophet will say, no, the prophet never said he's these things. Well, the prophet just did that without saying, I am a righteous leadership. He effectively just said that, because he used A, then B equals C.
Right. And most of the time we'll see like the senior apostle or one of the other apostles will say, like even Ezra Taft Benson's classic, the 14 points of following the prophet, where it defines that prophet can say anything and you have to obey him and he doesn't have to have training or anything. Well, it's very, people are not seeing that so much as self-serving if it's not the prophet saying it. If the prophet were to say it, then be like, that's self-serving, we can clearly discount it. But here he's doing it. He's basically saying, I have a sure knowledge of divine law, and that defines me as a righteous leader.
Mm-hmm.
And I think saying that prophets have a knowledge of divine law is very problematic in Mormonism, because when you go back and you see the statements of Brigham Young and Joseph Smith and the early prophets, where they articulated things as divine law that are now disavowed, then it calls these statements into question. But again, he's relying on people to only listen to what he's saying at the time and to accept it without critical thought.
He can't
And
even
so they
tell
don't
the
see those
difference
contradictions.
in a yellow jacket. So
Oh my goodness.
I won't
I
get
love
over
that
it.
you got stuck on that. You got stuck on that
I found
parable,
that
just like the bee got stuck in the butter.
That's right.
All right.
And more importantly, live, the more effective your righteous leadership will be.
Oh, so it was a little bit surprising to me, and maybe not as much to me as it may be to you, that he invokes this concept where he's trying to tell, and he's talking to young people, he's trying to tell them that one of the things that they need to prepare for is effective righteous leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that bumps into my mind is, well, he's probably only talking to the guys,
Mm-hmm.
because
Sure.
it's the men who are told to be righteous leaders in the house, righteous leaders in the church. Sure, a woman can be a righteous leader in the Relief Society under the stewardship of the righteous priesthood leader above him.
Yeah.
But I'm used to hearing those messages of being a righteous leader, because that's how they talk to priesthood. When you go to the priesthood session of conference, they talk to you about being a righteous leader. It's just interesting that now he's talking to a mixed gender I don't hear as much telling people to be righteous leaders when there's women involved as well. And maybe that's just my own
That's a good
myopic
catch. And the way that as someone conditioned, female LDS, what I envision is Beehive president. Okay. Relief Society president. I think of the leadership roles that were available to me as a woman, and then again compartmentalizing everything, just immediately gloss over that. Okay, he's talking to me, right? But there is a stark difference between when a guy hears that, he's imagining, well, maybe one day I could have divine knowledge and I could be prophet, right? The best I would have thought of is maybe one day I'll marry some guy who will become the prophet, right?
Right. I could be the wife of the prophet.
Yeah.
That's again, they've defined your potential and defined your identity according to the restriction based on your potential within their own leadership paradigm.
Yeah.
All right.
When I was a young medical student, my rigorous study of the human body convinced me that God is real and that He lives. As I came to know that the body really was God's creation, I became increasingly intrigued with the laws of God that govern the structure and the function of the body. Through years of extensive laboratory research, ultimately I learned that the law that governs the blessing of the beating heart is definable. And further, I learned that the beating heart could safely be stopped temporarily to facilitate delicate surgical repairs. How do we do that? We learned that all we had to do was reverse the normal sodium and potassium ratio of blood perfusing the heart. And then after the repairs were done, we nourished the heart with blood that had a normal sodium potassium ratio, and the heart bounced right back into life again.
I learned something new there, but this is why when Robert Lifton named the thought reform technique sacred science, this is what he meant initially. Now, if I were to define sacred science, this isn't how I would define it, but it is that merging of the sacred with science. He is saying here is a scientific thing that's rational and logical, and we can do laboratory tests on it, and we can prove it and show it, and this is why God, therefore God. And it seems rational, but it isn't rational. And this is what Lifton said creates a profound emotional feeling, a profound sense of euphoria, because it seems to click. It seems to all make sense. And you seem like you have the answers, and that cognitive consonance just floods your body. And He's basically co-opting that feeling of that excitement of learning something new and that excitement that you get when everything clicks together. And he's basically saying, and therefore God made all this. Without explaining the in-between part. He's just QED, and he doesn't explain this part up here.
Yeah, I think the experience that he's describing of learning the intricacies of the human body, and even to the nitty-gritty detail of potassium and sodium ratio, when you step back and think about it, a researcher can do these experiments and can make these observations and find them to be reproducible and consistent, and they don't have to have a particular belief in God in order to appreciate the beauty of a system like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he may have worked alongside a researcher who was a Baptist, a researcher who was a Catholic, or a researcher who was atheist, and each of them would have found a different nature of the profundity of what they were discovering. Mm-hmm. But he's using his own perception of it as a proof text that it's a divine law. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that people that do this research would say, well, I don't know that it's a divine law. It's something that's dictated by the receptors that are within the cell. And we know that it can be disruptive if we manipulate the receptors in a particular way. And it's reproducible because we understand it, because we've done the research. We've challenged our own limitations of knowledge and discovered these things. And what I find remarkable is how frequently religious leaders will use the discoveries of science, which are made through, as we talked about before, exploring doubt, exploring areas of uncertainty, exploring things that we didn't understand, and pushing boundaries, but they'll use that to reaffirm their own position in relation to God. So when he says these things prove God exists, the other thing that you have to accept within Mormonism is that also proves that God has made him his spokesperson, and you have to do everything that he says. So because the heart can be reversed, you have to do what this guy says.
And those tests went through rigorous doubts. I mean, I'm definitely not a doctor, but I know in general from science, if you're going to do some medical research and you submit a paper and it says sodium potassium ratios do this, there's going to be other people out there who say, okay, let's check this out, because I don't know if we believe you. And they're going to either do critical thinking against the paper, looking for flaws within the logic without doing any hands-on experimentation, or they'll go ahead and reproduce the experiment, or they'll reproduce the experiment with new twists. What if we do it this way or change it that way? Trying intentionally to break the theory behind that original paper, which is different, the opposite.
Yeah, for a more in-depth exploration of this theme, look at the Discovering Truth breakdown that we did a few weeks ago with the parable of the elephant from Dieter Uchtdorf.
Yep.
All right, let's keep going.
These findings prove to be predictable, dependable, and repeatable. Recently, I had the opportunity to explain this to a group of medical students. A learned professor who was there a little trouble by my telling him we could turn the heartbeat on and off. He asked me, but what if it doesn't work? I replied, it always works. It never fails. It works according to divine law.
Okay.
Moroni 10:4 didn't work for me. And that's the thing. The scriptures give you these experiments, and the people who it works for, they say, look, it always works. And the ones who it didn't work for, we aren't allowed to talk in church. We aren't allowed to tell our experiences.
Well, yeah, but remember, you didn't pray with real enough intent.
I know. That's right.
You included the variables that you needed. It's really odd to hear a doctor say it always works, because I think when you become familiar with how the human body works, then you also become familiar, because the way we discovered a lot of the ways it works is by finding out how things didn't work. You can learn about how parts of the brain work by when you have a stroke in that area and that part is not working, and how that changes the physiology, the behavior, the mentation. And, if you have a heart surgeon and the established practice of being able to prepare a heart for surgical procedure by altering its physiology, and when a esteemed professor, I think this is a common theme where a religious leader says something and then some worldly authority calls his statement into doubt, and it gives now it's like the persecuted innocence, and they can stand up for what it is. We hear Henry Eyring say it when he comes to give a blessing to a girl that was in a car accident, and the doctors are like, "Get out of here with your blessing." He's like, "No, we're going to give this blessing," and that girl was healed. We showed those medical practitioners. They said she was going to die. And so that theme of persecution is kind of flavored in what he's saying a little bit there. But it's allowing him to make the point that he wants to make. And that is that divine law, and again, somebody could, without knowing anything about Mormonism, study this process and come to the conclusion that it is reproducible and should be used in like coronary artery bypass surgery and stuff like that. They don't have to perceive it as divine law. They just have to perceive it as the normal physiology of the heart. But when he says these things are predictable, reproducible, dependable, what he's trying to really lay the groundwork for is that you need to obey the edicts of these brethren. And even if it doesn't seem like it's working or it's right now, just have faith that in the future it's going to work out, because it's predictable and it's reproducible and it's got to work. And as you allude to, if it's not working for you, it's something that you may have done wrong. That's where the blame reversal goes into it. There's always a way to reframe it.
He said no more. Divine law is incontrovertible and irrefutable.
Big problem with that, because when you believe that something that you've said is incontrovertible and irrefutable, you're setting yourself up for some dangerous stuff, because you're turning off. That's a thought terminating cliche.
Yeah.
You're disallowing yourself from thinking critically about it and saying, well, wait a second, is this how it is? We have statements from apostles in the not too recent future, or not too distant past, saying things like homosexuality is a perversion born of sin, and that masturbating will turn you gay, and that being gay is something that is reversible through science and therapy in a consistent, reproducible way. And these are all statements that, like, science is not based on the idea that any bit of law is uncontrovertible and irrefutable. Science invites the controversy and explores anytime there's something that seems to refute something that is known and established. That's an exciting area for exploration, because we're going to learn more things.
Yeah.
So there's a dangerousness in adopting this mentality that something is incontrovertible.
It's frankly prideful too. It's incredibly prideful. I mean, for a church that claims to teach humility, I notice they teach humility to the followers, but the leaders seem to be exempt from any saying or scripture or quote from any prophet about humility. They're exempt from it. And this is a great example of how he has exempted himself by associating himself with divine law. Therefore, he is irrefutable and incontrovertible. What the other word he said?
Right. Incontrovertible and irrefutable.
Yes.
And you nailed it on the head. What he's saying is that he articulates divine law. What he says is irrefutable.
Yeah.
Divine law cannot be denied or disputed.
So now we can't deny or dispute anything that he says.
I deny it. I dispute it.
We're gonna end we gotta end the podcast. All right, it's been nice. He said we can't dispute anything he says. No, we're gonna keep going. I'm sorry. My apologies to the president.
As long as you're obeying, relevant blessings always result.
Oh, I love that part. As long as you obey, relevant blessings always result. And this goes right into the prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
That you can find a couple of videos talking about prosperity gospel. It's definitely a part of Mormonism. They are less overt as televangelists, but what he just said lays out the whole thing, where if you obey the commandments, you're going to be physically and materially blessed, because those are the relevant blessings.
And very damaging to those who aren't blessed.
Exactly.
Because then what's funny is their own thing for why it hasn't happened.
When you look to the rich tradition of Judeo-Christian theology, you have the story of Job. Like the whole point of it was to diffuse that notion and to allow people to make sense of the fact.
Stories of Jesus too. I mean,
Yeah.
why is this man born disabled? Well, was it because of his sin or because of his parents' sin? And Christ was
Neither.
like, neither. Just how it was.
All right. Let's keep going.
Blessings are always predicated upon obedience to applicable law. I think you'll find something about that in the scriptures. Existentialists can expound, relativists can rationalize with their myopic views of reality. They may say that truth is only relative or even subjective. Wrong. God's laws are laws. God's truth is really true. What God says is right is really right, and what he says is wrong is really wrong.
It is so difficult to hear a prophet say that because, if you know anything about the history of racism with the church, like if you go to Thoughts on Things and Stuff blog and look for the articles about Laurie Nelson and Stuart Udall, they went to the prophets and they said, what we're teaching about blacks in the priesthood and curses and premoral less than valiant existence is wrong, and we need to change it. And the prophets told them, no, they're not wrong, you're wrong, and you need to get yourself in line. And his statement that the prophets know divine law, which is irrefutable and unchangeable, and what they say is right and wrong, is totally betrayed by history of Mormonism. And he's doubling down on these things. And what he's doing is he's laying all of these heavy weights on the minds and backs of everybody in the audience, that they can no longer question or dispute anything that the brethren say. And we know, because we've been in the church, he's talking not only about what he says, but what all of the apostles say, and even down to what your bishop and what your stake president say, because every one of them represents the Savior when it comes to you as a member. When you go to petition for anything, you have to go through those lines of authority.
Yeah, it's authoritarianism. It's obey and don't question. We're infallible.
Yeah, and so if you're trying to come to terms with how to accept your gay son or daughter, how to accept your own identity, you have to look to what these brethren say is right and wrong in order to see your life and its potential. Yeah. And so if you want to find complete fulfillment as a gay man or woman, or if you want to know whether to accept the significant other that your child has chosen to be a part of their life, and whether to completely embrace it or to hold it at arm's length and to keep it out of your inner circle of complete love and trust, then you have to look to the brethren, and the brethren are going to tell you, no, we cannot fall into that tolerance trap. Yeah. And what they say is right, and what they say is wrong, and we have to accept it. What does that do to the minds of Mormon politicians who are sitting in the halls of the legislature? When the brethren come and say, well, you need to vote for this or that thing, how can they have any expression other than obedience and be in good standing?
Yeah, that's a good point.
It gets me fired up because this is no Dieter Uchtdorf, nice, smiley, happy Mormonism. We're getting back to the exact obedience, get in line Mormonism.
Yeah. Yep.
But he's smiling. They control this universe and multitudes of others. When divine laws are broken, consequences follow. Our spirits ache for those who break God's laws because the consequences always bring misery.
Okay, so they've defined now. The difficulty I have with this is that they're providing a framework for people to see their families when they make choices other than the church. If you have a son or a daughter that chooses something other than the church, now you've got this framework of, well, you've chosen to break divine law, and that has consequences. Mm. And so now I can treat you at arm's length. Now I can hold you aloof and not embrace you fully. And that's a consequence of something you did. It's not me choosing to prioritize a controlling organization over love for my family. It's you and your consequence for disobeying the prophet.
Yeah, and it's a natural
And
consequences, and I'm acting the way God acts. I'm following the
right.
example of the prophet and the example of God, with the whole prodigal son thing, which that always got me with the prodigal son. Why didn't the father ever reach out to the son? And I think as that's a model for Mormons is, well, we'll accept you when you come back. I'm right. That's built right into that parable, but wasn't some of the responsibility on the father to meet the son halfway? To maybe go visit the son in the pigsty and say, hey, I care about you. I miss you, you know? The other thought I had on this, I've completely forgotten. So there you go.
All right. Well, let's
Something to do with consequences. It's important. It's logical on his face what he's saying, because obviously there are consequences. If I go stand out in the middle of the highway and then a car comes along and hits me, that's a consequence. So what he is saying is logical. The problem is, because there are consequences for our actions. And it seems like anyone arguing against him saying that is arguing against something that's really obvious, that there's consequences for our actions. The problem is the church is defining that wiggle room of how much you can do something without negative consequences to being this much. When I got out in the real world, I found out that my hands won't show up on the camera, but I found out that the wiggle room of choices that I could make without negative consequences was this much. It was huge. Yeah, I need to not go stand in the middle of the freeway. I need to not get addicted to cigarettes. I need to not, there's all kinds of really bad choices that, having unprotected sex, for instance, there's a lot of really bad choices that could hurt me, that could hurt other people. I shouldn't drink and drive. Lots of choices. Those choices are much broader choices. There's a lot more room of things I can choose to do within that. Whereas Mormonism says, don't ever drink. Don't ever not read your scriptures. Don't ever not pray. It's this much. I don't know if that makes sense or not. The logic isn't that your actions have consequences. The logic is which actions have what consequences, and that's what's flawed.
Yeah, and it stunts your growth in that you never actually get a chance to explore the real considerations that you have to take if you decide to have a life that is full of these other choices. That it's not simply making those choices, it's also learning about responsibilities that go along with those choices.
Yes, that's very important.
So one of the things that he says here is was interesting. He mentions existentialists expound, and then he talks about, these people say that truth is relative or subjective. No, truth is one way. And there's a little caveat in the Mormon definition of morality and truth that you don't hear invoked a lot, but Joseph Smith was very good at articulating it. And that is, if you go back and you read his expression of ethics in something called the Happiness Letter, then you'll see that there's a way that Mormonism can redefine what is right and wrong at any time. And that is, Joseph Smith very eloquently says in this letter that's full of some of the most beautiful prose that he has, that people that at one time God says, thou shalt not kill, but at another time he may say, thou shalt utterly destroy. And the only thing that is different is whatever God commands is right. And guess who tells you what God commands? Is the prophet. And so right or wrong is defined by what the prophet says. Now it's consistent, right? Whatever is right, and whatever is wrong is wrong. It's just that those right and wrong exist at the whim of whoever it is gets the privilege of saying what God's thoughts are. And that seed, anyone who's Mormon who wants to listen to these prophets needs to go and read the Happiness Letter and understand the implications of what Joseph Smith is talking about, because it's the very definition of subjective morality. It's subjective based on what the prophet says. Now, we in this era where there's one prophet and millions of leaders, that's one thing. But back in the time where it was Joseph Smith in his town, what that meant was, if he took you behind closed doors and said, hey, we're going to get this something going on, well, if well, I guess that's okay because the prophet told me to do it. And that was why this letter was written, was because he did that with the 19-year-old daughter of Sidney Rigdon. And she was like, no, that's wrong. I don't want to do that. And he's like, no, it's right. I'll write a letter and I'll show you how it's right.
Mhm.
And so that's one of those details that you don't really know about unless, on my list of videos to make is something about the happiness letter, because it is
Yeah,
the
I'd like to see
toxic
that.
core at the center of Mormonism.
It's
All right,
very David
let's keep-
Koresh.
Oh, yes.
If blessings are wanted, divine law must be obeyed.
Okay, just keep in mind, when he talks about blessings are wanted and Mormonism, they've captured your family. Your standing with your eternal family is predicated on obedience.
Yep.
Just as he said there. So when we think about the blessings, to a Mormon, the joy that they experience on a day-to-day basis, the happiness that I have with my family, the pleasure I take in their company, the fulfillment that I get from taking care of them and providing for them, all of that is told to me as in Mormonism is that is only a temporary thing that I get to enjoy unless I obey.
Yeah.
And then the relationships that I have with my family are null and void in the hereafter. That's so manipulative.
And here and now for many of us too.
Yeah.
I learned this lesson once again as President Spencer W. Kimball's surgeon. I implanted a pacemaker in him previously, and then one day I got a phone call from a doctor elsewhere who said that President Kimball's pacemaker is not working well. Oh, my heart sank. Well, I said, send up. As we met, President Kimball first asked me to give him a blessing. In that blessing, I promised correction of his failed pacemaker. When the blessing was over, he said to me, now you may proceed to do whatever you need to do to make that blessing a reality. He and I both understood that a broken law had to be fixed. So I proceeded with an operation. On the wire that carried electricity from the pacemaker down to his heart, I found a break in the insulation. When I replaced that faulty wire, the pacemaker immediately worked again, allowing President Kimball's heart to beat normally. The point is that not even for God's prophet could the law relating to the transmission of electricity be ignored. Well, let me tell you, President Kimball was a prophet of God. As I watched him closely through various illnesses, observed his intense and penetrating studies, he sought revelation. He was.
Before we get too far away from his story about the pacemaker, I think it's important to realize there's a little bit of the mystical manipulation going on there. If he had given him a blessing that his pacemaker would be fixed and it wasn't fixed, we never would have heard the story.
Right.
But since now he can frame it in a way where the outcome was positive, then it seems to reinforce this idea that his inspired blessing of the prophet came to fruition.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that component of it. And the other thing is that we're now taking the laws of physics that are agnostic. They say nothing about God one way or the other. But we're ascribing it to divine law.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's capturing it as though, because he's the one that understood and affected it, then what he's doing as a doctor is the hands of God sort of thing. And he's giving us this story that elevates our esteem for him as somebody who literally worked God's will in doing this.
I'd like to point out he didn't learn how to do that operation from the Bible or the Book of Mormon or from Revelation. He learned that from his medical teachers, through experience, and all of that was gained through many centuries of science.
But Mormonism hasn't, though, because they'll say that that the Holy Ghost is what enabled every bit of that science along the way.
Yeah. But if you have a psychological problem in the most complex organ of the human body, which is the brain and nervous system, you're going to be told to go read the scriptures and pray and maybe see an LDS therapist, so long as that therapist doesn't say anything that goes against the American Psychological Association. That one just always gets me. This idea that you need to go to medical school to learn how to fix a pacemaker, but you got something wrong with this right here, with your emotional system, with your mental system, and just pray, read the scriptures. God will take care of it. So, yeah.
Okay, let's see here. I do find it, in one sense, there's a good aspect of this, and that is, like, if you watch John Oliver's piece on televangelists, he includes a segment where you have televangelists telling people that they need to rely on faith in lieu of medical science, in lieu of chemotherapy, in lieu of radiation or science, and send them the money. And I think it speaks to why Mormonism has been so long-lived and why individuals within Mormonism can be so successful. And that is that it includes these concepts of faith, but it ties it to action. Yeah. And so in his case, his action as a surgeon was the fulfillment of this paradigm he set up, where it was going to be the fulfillment of prophecy, you know, as long as it turned out that way. And so that, you know, I think is one of the reasons that people see Mormonism as this faith that gives people an internal resilience or you know, something to Mormons.
Yeah, and I that is something I appreciate about Mormonism, and I think that may be why the psychology stuff bothers me so much, the therapy stuff bothers me so much, because that is where they part with science, and perhaps because the field of psychology does have a number of conflicts with, you know, when it comes to heart health, there are very few conflicts with Mormonism in anything you learn about heart health. When it comes to mental health, there are conflicts with Mormonism and what the American the APA says on the thing. So I think that's why it bothers me, because Mormonism does part with science on that one.
Yeah, I think particularly because the things that we talk about in terms of manipulation and control, they are not benign things that simply, oh, I'll make a different choice one day or another. They actually weigh heavily on your psyche, and they cause internal anxiety, internal stress, and this builds over time and waxes and wanes and cause a lot of the problems that may lead someone to go to a mental health professional. And if that mental health professional identifies the toxic components of Mormonism which lead to that, they may tell you that for your own health and safety, you need to let go of those things. And that's where you mentioned it would conflict with Mormonism, which is why they have their own mental health professionals, which operate within this paradigm of, you know, licensing, but then restrict what therapies that they feel comfortable offering or what they can offer to things that are consistent with church teachings.
Yeah, and therapy also offers alternatives to finding happiness that are a little bit more repeatable. I mean, it's not a perfect science like a lot of other sciences, because it is the most complex. It's a very complex organ, but it's repeatable enough that if you go to a therapist and you do, for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy, you will most likely see some kind of positive results. And you might start to contrast that with the very less specific, read the scriptures and pray, and you'll get your answers there. So there's a lot of ways that it conflicts, maybe not always directly, but indirectly as well.
But only if you do cognitive therapy with real intent.
That's right.
My mentor.
Oh, he just said Spencer W. Kimball was his mentor. That's like very important, because what we're seeing is a return to the Spencer W. Kimball miracle of forgiveness, toxic perfectionism mindset.
My love for him is boundless. I've had a spiritual confirmation of every prophet with whom I have served. Well, the world is filled with uncertainty. But there need be no uncertainty in your heart and in your mind about what is true and what is not true. Uncertainty.
It is just so personally damaging to go about the world feeling that you have it all figured out and that there's no need for any uncertainty. And I think people that leave Mormonism, one of the real challenges is coming to terms with uncertainty. Because one of the appealing aspects of Mormonism is that it provides you with so much certainty about where you came from, why you're here, how you get to where you're going to go, and what your purpose in life is. But these things, all of these certain things are tied to hoops you have to go through, to self-defeating ways of thinking about yourself and the world, to all of these toxic ideas that when you unplug from Mormonism, suddenly you hear it all the time, where it feels like the ground is crumbling beneath you, because suddenly you're cast into all of this existential despair about finding meaning in life and finding purpose in life, because since the church captured and defined all of those important questions, you were never allowed to grow into maturity and to come to terms with uncertainty, to embrace the beauty of uncertainty, and to embrace the openness that it gives you in looking at the world and in conducting your life.
Yeah, I love uncertainty. Uncertainty about my finances and physical stuff, I'm still
Not
bothered
so
by,
much.
obviously. But spiritual uncertainty, or other types of uncertainty about the questions that have to do with life, there is a spirituality within that. There is a joy and if you've made your peace with uncertainty, it becomes the questions themselves I've found are more fascinating than the answers. There's a sense of wonder to them, a sense of, it's really hard to put into words. The best book I read on this subject is Hymns to an Unknown God by Sam Keen, who just sort of makes a really good case for not having all of the answers. And I really enjoyed that book. So, yeah. Yep.
All right. Let's, no uncertainty. Okay, let's keep going.
He is born of imperfect or incomplete information. To God, there is no conflict between science and religion. All truth is. I plead with you, dear brothers and sisters, to learn God's irrevocable laws. Learn them by study and by faith. That means, among other things, living by every word that proceeded forth from the mouth of God.
I want to add that maybe to an omniscient God, there is no conflict between religion and science, but to Mormonism, there is conflicts between religion and science. And I think trying to make those distinctions between the leadership and a concept of God is really important. Yes, if you're the being that knows everything about the universe, there is no difference between whatever your religion is and science. But to Mormonism, there are plenty of conflicts between Mormonism and science. For instance, DNA in the Book of Mormon, and locations in the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, some of the stuff we've talked about in psychology, sexuality, homosexuality, lots of science about LGBT issues that is in direct conflict with the Proclamation on the Family. So just a quick thought there.
No, I think it's important because what he's doing is he's reinforcing the groundwork that Dieter Uchtdorf laid in that last video with the elephant. And that he's talking about this notion where when we consider the questions that the church has addressed in our world, if we see inconsistencies between science and religion, we just need to wait until the eternities and we'll see that religion was correct all along and they had more knowledge that could add context to what science was observing, and it will all make sense in the future. And what this does is it induces everybody, if they ever detect any conflicts, to simply shut that down in your brain. Don't think about it. You don't need to think about it, because whatever God's mouthpiece says is true will ultimately be proven to be true, even if we think it conflicts with science now. So if you read something that's conflicting in scripture or that a past prophet has said that seems to contradict science, don't worry about it, because we'll understand in the future. And and this is a really, it's something they have to do, because that's the way that you can dismiss those concerns from the past. But I find it to be very deceptive and very manipulative, and it's difficult to hear that come from these brethren.
Prayer is a key. Pray to know what to start doing and what to stop doing. Pray to discern between God's laws and the philosophies of men.
Okay. I love that he gave people permission to pray, to discern between God's laws and the philosophies of men. But you've got to remember that he already told you that anything that he says is
Mhm.
indisputable and irrefutable. And when he says the philosophies of men, he knows that we don't consider the prophet and the apostles to fall under the category of the men who philosophize. They're not
Right.
philosophers. Go ahead.
That's a really good point. No, I was just laughing because I never really thought of it that way. I am so programmed to think the philosophies of men are this other carnal, worldly thing, and that I automatically make the separation that they want me to make. And you putting them back together it just made me chuckle because yeah, they are men, and these are their philosophies. So it's the
Right.
same.
But
Okay.
it just that you said, you mentioned it before, how the people hearing him are already conditioned to understand that he's not in that category that we're talking about.
Mhm.
But, you know, if people do retain their autonomy and they do retain their ability to think critically, what they should be doing is what he's saying. And that is, when you hear something come from these brethren, you know, if you want to pray about it, if you want to appeal to a higher power and say, wait, is this right or wrong? Some people may look at that higher power as God. Some people may look at that higher power as their own conscience. And if it contradicts any of those things, you should have the autonomy to be able to say, no, I reject it. I'm going to say no to that particular teaching, to that particular policy. And I'm still a good person because I've appealed to a power that is within me that I can connect with. And I've been able to discern between the philosophy of man and what should be a divine law.
Yeah, and that situation you just described doesn't happen within Mormonism. It does happen
Because they've
in
already
certain other groups.
set it up
Your
that
group.
if you have an answer that comes that contradicts something the brethren have said, then you've got to doubt that answer. And this is something that Elder Irene and Elder Holland told to the youth in the face-to-face event from March of 2017 in Palmyra. There's a video on the YouTube channel for Thoughts on Things and Stuff talking about how you should perceive answers to prayer, and it addresses that question. Basically, if you get an answer and it contradicts the brethren, the answer is wrong, and you've got to obey the brethren. So this prayer to discern between the philosophies of men and God's laws has caveats, and they protect the brethren.
Beware of the cunning counterfeits of the adversary. Through eons of time, Lucifer has honed his craft. He is skilled at distraction, distortion, and deception. I plead with you to avoid his scheming snares as you would avoid a plague. Entrapments designed by Satan can only bring you misery, spiritual captivity, and death. This is true every time. Don't be like the bee in the butter.
So much phobia induction that just, again, the Satan stuff just really gets me. And part of why it gets me, and it's funny because the longer I'm out of Mormonism, the more it gets me. And partly because he's talking about you and me. Here we are, where we are putting in the effort to make our rational arguments. We are appealing to reason. We are doing our research. We're doing all this stuff. And he can just dismiss it with, well, because Satan.
Yeah,
And
the thing is,
no effort.
He says that Satan has eons to hone his craft, and it's very appealing and very attractive. And what that translates to in real life is that if people who are critics of the church are able to make rational, ethical, compelling arguments about why some of the things that they talk about are wrong or unfounded, then the more rational, the more compelling it is. It's almost like a testament to how deceptive and sneaky Satan is. You know, you made that argument sound really good. That's just proof that Satan is really powerful, and I don't have to listen to it.
And the more upset we get about being maligned like this, then that's just more proof, because anger comes from Satan too. And so I don't ever feel like I have a right when he calls me names and aligns me with Satan, and basically is saying, well, you've just been deceived by the greatest evil ever. If I rightly, by the way, get offended by that, then that's yet another, oh, well, look, Satan
Right.
would be making her all angry and stuff. Well, no, those are normal human reactions to having being lined up with evil. So
If you chose to be offended, and that's because Satan has it. All right. And he ties it again to your existence is in peril.
yes.
This is not just, are you listening to your son who's telling you about his challenges with believing in the gospel? It's if you listen too much and you start to have empathy and try to understand his perspective, well, that's one of Satan's traps. That's the tolerance trap. And you're going to put your spiritual existence in peril. Be wise, be careful. He's really tying in this be parable.
Yeah. And that's where the phobias come from. That is how you induce phobias in people. If you do this, these bad things will happen to you.
Yeah, and the language he uses, entrapment, spiritual captivity, misery, and death, these are all really hard-hitting negative words that he's attaching to anything that would contradict the brethren, anything that would refute them, anything that would, it's very black and white thinking. You can now divide the world into things for the church and things against the church, and all of these things follow from speaking against the brethren.
And words make you feel things.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, this is the first deconstruction that we've done of an actual talk from a sitting prophet, if I recall. And
might be.
And I've had conversations before with my brothers, and they've specifically warned me, you need to be very careful about talking about the prophet and what the prophet says. And I think that's part of that same sort of phobia sort of thing that's happening. And I know they're saying that out of love for me, but also out of a devotion to the organization and what they're told to believe about these brethren.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing is he talks about cunning counterfeits of the adversary, and that speaks again to this. They're going to be able to take anything that you can value in your life and call it a counterfeit. If you've found meaning, if you've found love, if you've found fulfillment in anything outside of the church, they can just say, oh, well, that's counterfeit. If you want to have something that is really lasting and is really real, then you need to come and follow our rules and do our handshakes and do this stuff and pay us.
Yeah. It's into continuing doubts even after you leave the church.
Yeah.
Of where, okay, I'm happy now, but I was told I was supposed to be miserable and dying right now, and I'm not. So maybe I'm imagining this. So it just feeds into those cycles.
Yeah.
Be wise, be careful. The sad consequences of yielding to any of Lucifer's lures are predictable, dependable, repeatable, and regrettable.
Okay, so you've got to be wise, meaning if you choose to disobey them, just like the bee was stupid, you are unwise. You got to be careful. So you're being careless. You're not even thinking if you choose anything other than what the brethren say. And he's saying every time you make choices other than to church, you're going to be miserable. It's predictable, repeatable, and regrettable. And what this does is it invalidates the experience of somebody who loses the church who wants to reconnect with their family. If you have left the church and you found that without of this air of toxic perfectionism, you have a weight lifted off of your shoulders. If you find that the community and friendship you may find in a different community church or in a secular organization gives you fulfillment and a sense of belonging, then all of those things that you may go back and talk to your family about and to convey to them, they're going to say, well, that's not real. That's you're just trying to reach for the true things that we have there. And this also keeps those family from validating your experience and saying, well, wait a second, I guess people can be happy outside of the church. I guess people can find fulfillment. Maybe I could look other places and find something that I'm missing. It prevents them from having that experience.
And it destroys our connections with our family. when there's all those mental divides and assumptions about the members of our family, we can't connect with them. We can't know about them. We can't learn their lives. I mean, I've spent most of my exile from my family unable to talk to them about the loves in my life, the various people that I've had relationships with, the daily ins and outs of my life, partly because we hardly ever talk, but when we do, there's that fear on my part that they're going to make assumptions about what I'm saying. Are they reading between the lines, looking for some kind of flaw in my story, or some way they can attack, and I have been doubted and attacked by certain family members, and then on their end, they're not really getting to know me and what's important in my life because they think they have all the answers and I don't. So this whole Mormonism is about family stuff. This is a way that Mormonism is damaging to families.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. And that's one of those things where it's hard to convey that to someone unless you experience it. And that, people don't appreciate how lives can be affected in that way.
Yeah.
All right, let's see here.
Conversely, I promise you that as you know the truth will make you free. This freedom will unveil to you your divine nature and allow you to prosper personally.
Like, how is that message going to resonate with somebody who is gay?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you know the truth, and so within the paradigm of Mormonism, the truth is that even if we accept that you may have been born gay and it's not a choice of wickedness, then your special challenge in life is to remain celibate, to abstain from finding complete emotional and physical fulfillment and connection with the object of your own choice and your own desire, and to, the greatest expression of your faith and devotion is to remain in that deprived state until you die, with the promise and hope that after you die, your very nature will be changed into something else. And when you talk to gay men and women who have come to a measure of acceptance about themselves, they don't view their homosexuality as a curse or something that they are just waiting to get changed. They see it as an integral part of their identity, something that defines them, that is a part of them. And to suddenly hold the notion that that's going to get ripped out and changed into this thing that they've seen as almost an oppressive element in their life is
devastating.
It betrays their whole concept of being able to accept themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the freedom he's talking about. That is what he's saying. People are going to be free once they recognize the truth, which is the truth is that you have to accept what these men say. And then your divine nature is only confined to what they prescribe for you.
Mm-hmm.
There's no space for homosexuality in what Mormonism identifies as divine nature, because it's tied to progeny and spiritual progeny and their narrow construction of what a family can be.
You'll be free from the bondage of sin. You'll be free to be you and effective righteous living. You'll be free to be prepared to lead by precept and example wherever you are needed. Truly, the blessings of keeping God's commandments are also predictable, dependable, and repeatable.
I'll say, if he says that one more time, I'm going to say he's getting predictable and dependable. Capitalism, third one. Repeatable.
But all right.
I'm here all week.
Sadly, in terms of manipulative language, these brethren are predictable, dependable, and repeatable, as you say in that regard. You'll be free from the bondage of sin. You'll be free to be you. When he says you'll be free to be you, again, that's just reinforcing this notion that you aren't who you are truly unless you've put yourself in the box of Mormonism.
Yep.
And
there's people that fit that really well. There's people, they get into Mormonism, that's their people, that's their culture. They like the rules, they like the casseroles, they like the whole deal. They like the leadership positions that they get and the culture, and they fit really well within Mormonism. And for them, what he's saying is true to their experience. I did the thing. I was released from the bondages of sin, and now I'm free to be me, and I'm happy and overjoyed with that. They can't see, they struggle to see how so many other people do not fit that box so neatly. And we didn't fit in. We didn't have a bunch of friends and that comforting feeling that you get when you feel like you're kind of coming home. They don't,
Even
it's people, they don't fit into that experience, and it's doubly painful for the people that don't fit.
and even I think it's easy almost for us to categorize people as the ones who are going to be ex-Mormon and the ones who are TBM, or the ones who are, in the church mindset. But I think even acknowledging that an individual will have, people describe seasons in their life. An individual may have a time in their life where it does work for them. But we're all dynamic individuals. We're all changing and learning and recreating ourselves based on our experiences. And there may be a time where somebody who did find complete fulfillment in the church is having to reevaluate things based on the experiences that they've had in their lives. Yeah. And as you say, if they're only providing a paradigm for existence that is in the complete obedience mindset, which he has reinforced several times in this talk, never take the first step, exact obedience, complete yielding to, or complete obedience to God's commands. This is a extreme description of how you should live your life in terms of not even once. Mm-hmm. And it's something that does not adapt itself to real life and the way that humans dynamically change over time.
Yeah, the way that a theoretical God might have designed us as well. Point that out. I mean, God made us this way for a reason, if he made us.
And this is the second time he brings up this effective righteous leadership. You'll be prepared to lead by precept and example wherever you are needed. And it's fun to hear the oldest member of the church almost talk to the younger group. And we hear usually Ballard do this, where he's like, you guys are the next generation of leaders. You guys, and I think it's good that they're validating. I think they're giving some aspiration, maybe allowing the young people to not see such a broad divide between the leaders and themselves. I think if they can tie these young people into a mindset where they see themselves as the leaders of the next generation, then maybe it will bridge that divide. But I'm just afraid they're too disconnected from the mindset of the millennials and from what it means to have instant Google answers at your fingertip, but also what it means to have grown up in an era where the movies that you're watching are all about questioning authority and all about rights of individual and the respect for an individual experience, and pointing out the problems of blind obedience and looking at the world through a dogmatic lens. If they don't realize that's the milieu that they're growing up in outside of the church, and those messages are going to start to affect them when they clash with the church, they're going to start losing that generation, as rumor is that they already have.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep going.
As members of his restored church, we know that Jesus Christ, our Master, is our ultimate mentor. One day he will rule and reign as the millennial Messiah. You, as a true millennial, were born to be a true disciple of Jesus Christ.
Just again, he's done that thing where he's used the word true. So you may have thought, hey, I'm a millennial. He's like, no. You can't be a true millennial unless you define yourself as a true disciple of Jesus Christ, meaning that you obey with exactness everything that myself and all these other old guys say. And you can't see the world or yourself through any other lens if you want to truly claim your identity as a millennial. So they've captured that identity now. And it's great because it uses the millennial word, which is tied to these religious themes of Christ returning for the last millennium and to reign.
It's a little late, though, because, technically his young adult audience here, technically they're millennials, but those are the youngest millennials. That's the last of the batch. There are millennials in their mid-30s now. It's clever. They're kind of late. They need to work Homeland or Gen Z somehow into that, because that's the next batch, and people are talking about them now. So
In fact, the only way for you to be a true millennial is to be one of his dependable millennial disciples.
What does it mean to be a dependable millennial disciple?
Dependable, repeatable disciple.
That's right. Dependable, repeatable, replaceable. You know.
Serve others with love. Doing so will open your mind to personal revelation and inner peace.
Okay, serve others with love. How many religious leaders around the world would convey those exact same sentiments? Mm-hmm. Let's see. Would the Pope say serve others with love? Yes. Would Billy Graham say that? Yes. Would any religious leader of any bent say it? Would Dr. Phil say it? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so, all right.
Learn to hear the voice of the Lord through the whisperings of the Holy Ghost. As helpful.
Now, I want to add that pushing people's love button, which you just did, talking about serving others with love, is going to evoke in a lot of people a sort of a sense of that feeling. And then when he follows it with whisperings of the Spirit of the Lord, you're going to conflate those two feelings together. And since we're told the Spirit of the Lord feels like a warmth in the bosom, you're being mystically manipulated into feeling the Spirit right in that moment when he says that, because he makes you feel love, and then he says that.
That's a great point,
on a lot of people.
You can think of the concept of serving with love, and that gives you that euphoric notion. But then when he ties it to the whispering of the Spirit, then you think, oh, well, that's the Spirit telling me that it's true. This is coming from the prophet, so the prophet is true. So it all ties together harmoniously.
Twitter and Facebook, maybe. They simply do not provide answers to life's most important questions.
Okay.
Yeah, they do. But okay.
So this is part of milieu control, where he is planting seeds of doubt about the concept of looking for truth through an internet search. Now, if we want to know the population of Zimbabwe, if we want to know, how many people, or what is the mechanism of a LCD television, then maybe we could go and do an internet search and find some truth regarding those objective sort of facts. If we were to type what's the meaning of life in Google, well, we might find a list of things that numerous groups have proposed. And he's right, we're not going to find the meaning of life, but we've now transposed this, dismissal of Google as a way to find any degree of truth, and that's going to be transposed over church history. So now, if you find some statement by some prior prophet that completely contradicts current prophets and sounds more like a leader of the KKK than like a Mormon leader, well, we can demonize and dismiss that, because that's, you can't depend on Google or Facebook or any of these things. Not only that, but, Facebook, why do we go to Facebook for? Well, Facebook, people, that's the meeting of ideas, the exchange of argument and ideas, where people can be exposed to new ideas. And I think Mormonism has had a significant effect because of Facebook, where people have learned things about church history, about conflicting doctrine, about some of the stuff, maybe even like what we do here, Thoughts on Things and stuff has a Facebook page that gets a fair amount of traffic, and different memes and stuff introduce people to ideas they may not have seen before. And so we're now demonizing those social media platforms in addition to basic internet searches as potential sources that can be problematic.
And there is there are competing ideas as well. It's not just about the negative things that can thwart Mormonism's message. It's also, I argue that you can find the meaning of life on Google. The difference when you're Googling, you're self-directing those questions. I get to say, this is the particular problem that the finding happiness right now. What about meditation? What about Buddhism? What about Taoism? What about and you can say, or psychology or other secular resources, you can say, here's the problem I'm having or the question that I have, and do your own exploration. This website appeals to me, this one doesn't. This answer is interesting. I'm going to do a new search based on that information. I was an early internet adopter. I was on BBSs I was 16 in 1992. I could say that a majority, I would say most of the books in my library that have had significant meaning to me, I found because of someone on the internet recommending them to me, or a search that I did, or some website that I read comparing religions to each other, and asking questions. I found a lot of the answers, those spiritual or meaning of life sort of big answers, starting on the internet. So, and it can keep with Mormonism. It's alternate answers.
Yeah.
So,
and when we talked before about embracing uncertainty, if you get to the point in life where you're embracing uncertainty, then part of the meaning that you'll find in your life is a search for different ways of looking at things, for different answers. And that, the most powerful way that we have to find new information, new ideas like that, are some of these platforms.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Study the family of Proclamation to the World. Study the Living Christ document. These are books received by revelation. I was part of that. I know what it was like.
And I believe recently it was shown in a conference of maybe his talk, where that revelation was received by a committee having a draft of the document, and they revised the draft a few times. And if you look at the history of the family of Proclamation, it kind of redefines what revelation is. But since we've been redefining what translation is, I guess it makes perfect sense.
The Revelation Committee.
Yeah.
Well, post these documents where you can see them daily and refer to them and understand what they really mean. Those and other expressions revealed from heaven are what every true Latter-day Saint believes.
All right, just remember, he used that buzzword, what every true Latter-day Saint. So if you're a Latter-day Saint and you haven't read through these documents, posted them for where you can see them, memorize them, and refer to them frequently, then you're not a true Latter-day Saint.
Or if you disagree with them. What if you're a gay Latter-day Saint or an activist like the Mama Dragons that are in support of LGBT members, and you disagree with certain points in the family proclamation, then you're also not a true Scotsman, as the fallacy is named.
And that's you alluded to a logical fallacy, the no true Scotsman thing. But I think this is almost something. I think some general authorities rely on this manipulative lever more than others, and we're learning that Nelson does this, where you can say you're not a true fill in the blank unless you do this. And imagine if you did that to your family. Like, you're not a true member of this family if you ask me any questions when I tell you what to do. That's like an abusive thing. That's like that puts it automatically puts your children on the outside unless they submit, and you would never treat your child that way. But if you see the church leader saying that, then it's okay.
Then it's okay.
Pray for witness to those truths represent divine law. Learn to articulate those truths in your own words. Practice. Then pray and look for opportunities to speak what you believe.
Probably should talk about here, which is we don't get to talk about this one very often, because usually it's the prophet up there, the whatever leader saying things, and that's the one where if you say things in public, whether you want, you will come to believe those, because your mind needs to reconcile the things that you've told other people with what you truly believe. And the easiest way to fix that is not to say, oh, I was lying. The easiest way is to say, just to think deep down, oh yes, that must actually be true.
The classic Seinfeld quote of, it's not a lie if you believe it. But then just, doing it from the back end, which is, he didn't, it's one of these things where they give you something that you need to believe. They tell you to pray for a witness that it's true. They don't say, look at it, study it. Maybe you'll accept it as truth. Maybe you won't. They say, pray until you get a witness that it's true. If you haven't gotten a witness that it's true yet, keep praying, and eventually you get a witness that it's true. And even if you don't get a witness that it's true, start to testify that it is anyway, because the best way to gain a testimony is to bear it, which is another thing that Elder Oaks has said. And once you say these things, as you talk about, once you verbalize them, we know from studies in social psychology that doing that increases the chance that you'll accept what you say as truthful. And that's how they get you.
Yep.
All right, let's keep going.
Your ability to lead and to have righteous influence will increase as you do so. I watched President Kimball practice over and over again some of the truths that he was going to teach before he was going to be interviewed, even before he performed our sealing in the temple. He practiced the words that he was going to say, and that's the way he got really good at what he said. Well, in the coming day, you will present yourself before the Savior.
I think it's interesting when he mentions that these brethren that are vocalizing their revelatory product, whether it's a blessing or a sealing or an interview, they've got sound bites that they're rehearsing, that they're practicing. And so when we hear it, we think, oh, wow, that's so inspired. That's so great. And it's kind of like peeling back the curtain to see that this is a rehearsed and practiced sort of thing. Like you can read your Patriarchal Blessing and you can read things that sound very regal and majestic and spiritual and inspirational. But then if you get 10 other people to show you their Patriarchal Blessing and you realize that they're using these trite phrases again and again and again and again, because they're just rehearsed phrases that maybe use some biblical language here and there and a smattering of pious language from over there. And you realize it's a religious product that's designed to appeal to our sense of what religious language is, and is a very rehearsed and manipulated thing. Kind of like when outsiders hear the story of the Book of Mormon and they read the Book of Mormon, they're like, why is this written in Elizabethan King James English when it's not tied to that translation process at all? But as Mormons, we just accept it because it's the way that Scripture talks, and it gives it this air of authority because it uses the same mode of speaking as the King James Bible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I don't got any problem with people rehearsing, if they're in some sort of public figure, but I think the contrast there is that they're sort of purporting or trying to purport that they're just naturally spiritual or naturally, these, like you said, they're inspired. And I think that that's where I have a problem with it. When I watch a comedian or an actor or a news anchor, even my own self as someone who speaks, I don't do a lot of rehearsing, but sometimes if there's a tricky idea I'm trying to convey, I might think through, okay, how am I going to do this? That comedian or actor that gets up there isn't pretending to maybe be spiritual. And I think that's where maybe I have the harder time with it is when they're sort of like, oh, well, I'm just Moses. I'm just really bad at talking, but blah, here's this godly thing I'm saying. There's usually the lights shining out, and not the asterisk. I didn't practice this 20 times in front of a mirror before getting up here. Right. So that's the potential deception there is what bothers me. So.
You'll be overwhelmed to the point of tears to be in his holy presence. You'll struggle to find words to thank him for paying for your sins, for forgiving you of any unkindnesses toward others, for healing you from the injuries and injustices that you have sustained in life. You will thank him for strengthening you to do the impossible, for turning your weaknesses into strengths, and for making it possible for you to live with him and with your family forever.
This one's hitting the emotional buttons, you're going to feel the spirit now buttons, because you're touching on guilt, the whole atonement guilt for all of your sins, but immediately directing that to gratitude rather than the fear side of that. You're going towards gratitude. And so you might feel like, oh man, that was that really thing I really did that I regretted, but I'm free now. And so that whole experience of being sad and repenting from that is immediately going to come back to your body as you feel it throughout your body. And then he's going on to all of these other blessings that you have, including your family, and all of he's just basically taking you will feel the spirit button and just mashing it like 3 or 4 times all in a row,
And every level that he does that is hammering down the dependence upon the organization. Because while he's invoking the name of Christ, which is a very powerful focus of invocation right there as well, he's reminding you with every one of those points how dependent you are on obedience to them in order to gain these things that he claims you are going to get from submitting to the church through Christ. And any organization that claims to be Christian will use the same sort of thing. Your access to the blessings of Christ is dependent on your obedience. And Mormonism, I think Nelson is being very cunning or very elegant here in that he's not focusing on what you had to do in order to get those blessings of Christ that you're going to be so grateful for. He's just focusing on the gratitude. And the implicit thing is, you had to pay, pray, and obey. You had to do all the things. You had to endure to the end. You had to be exact. All these other things that are part of what he said leading up to this point.
Yeah. Yep.
His divine identity, his purpose, his atonement, and his attributes will become personal and real to you. But you don't have to wait until then. Choose to be one of his true disciples now.
There's that word again, man. I'm seeing it everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
I'm noticing it now that you pointed it out. He's got it all through here.
I wanted to talk about true and real for a long time. And Nelson is one of the guys who does it more than anyone else. But it's interesting because I think when you talk about archetypes, Satan embodies everything that is wrong and bad. And Christ and God embody everything that is good. And so he can easily use these names to elevate and to demonize what he wants to do to pull people in one direction or another of how they should feel about themselves in relation to the things that he as the leader is telling them. And so he's aligned himself with the archetype of everything good, Christ, and tied it into what you as an individual has to do it. And so it's just interesting to see how he plays with that name.
Yeah.
Who truly wants to serve and love and lead as he did. We are his people. We are under covenant to carry the message of the gospel to every kindred, nation, tongue, and people. As we work intentionally to become righteous leaders, we may sing with one heart. Let us all press on in the work of the Lord.
Okay, again, he's
redefined. That's what
this
opening song was. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's probably praise to the man. I don't know.
Well, no, he just quoted, "Let us all press on." So
again, they've claimed your identity. You are, his chosen disciples, and then he's defined your works. Your life's work is the work of the Lord. So everything that you do falls within that paradigm. And he's invoked covenants that you've made, which we understand to be the covenants in the temple, which are that's kind of the deep programming of everything that you are or have or will be or will ever have, you devote to the building up of the kingdom of God. And it puts you in a position where you can really never step out of line. It's very powerful stuff.
Now, my dear brothers and sisters, I would like to leave a blessing upon each of you. You dear friends, brothers and sisters, invoking the keys of the holy apostleship vested in me, I urge you to feast upon the words of the Lord Jesus Christ, to learn God's laws and live by them. I bless each of you to be a good example, to be a true disciple of Jesus Christ, in word and in
So
deed.
I'd like to point out these aren't blessings. These are commandments. Like, so far, each one is a commandment, not a blessing.
But he's blessing you to live up to the commandment.
Yeah, but this is one thing I noticed about baptismal covenants. It's supposed to be a trade. We get the holy gift of the Holy Spirit, and in trade, we have to do the commandments. Well, what is the Holy Spirit for? It's to help you do the commandments. Like, it's in the sacrament prayer. Like the sacrament prayer says that it's been so long since I've heard it, but that you get the gift of the Holy Spirit so that you can follow the commandments. There's nothing in that promise that's bilateral. It's a unilateral promise. And he's doing the same thing with this. I bless you that you'll obey. But here's a gift. The gift is you give me $500.
It's funny.
Anyway,
Evil Apostate did a review of Elder Bednar, one of Elder Bednar's talk. And at the end of his talk, he blessed them. He's like, you blessed me to be able to understand your big, long, boring speech. It was like, he gave this talk about understanding your position in the link of your generations. And at the end, he said, I bless you to understand your position in the link of generation. It's like, okay, that's an interesting blessing. All right.
yeah, that's interesting.
It sounds like that's what's going on here. So it's almost like, when you give a speech, you say what you're going to say, you say what you say, and then you say what you said. And now it's kind of like, well, let's just take the apostolic blessing and make that the summary.
Yeah.
He's hitting again all the major points and saying, I'm going to bless you to do all these things I just told you should be doing.
Yeah.
I bless you to resist sin, to radiate goodness in a way that will attract others to want to be more like you. I want you to know and feel the source of the light within you. I bless you with success in your occupational and educational pursuits.
Okay, there's a blessing. There you go. You get one, maybe two real blessings.
Well, the thing is, like, so what does that mean? Everybody in the audience is going to do good in school and have a good business? Like, it's one of these things where it will make people feel good and it will, I think, tie them to him as a leader. But statistically, we know that that's not going to happen. But it does feel good to hear it.
Well, then they blame themselves. The ones that are left blame themselves for not living up to their part of the bargain.
Yeah.
I bless you to seek for and care for your virtuous companion.
I love that phrase, your virtuous companion, because he's tying an element of, you have to seek a companion who is also being obedient to us.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's the companion you're getting blessed to receive. So if maybe you had a friend that you connected with at work who wasn't a church member but doesn't want to join the church, well, maybe that's not your virtuous companion because they are not, they're not living the life of virtue as defined by Mormonism.
And because you'll be less dependent then on the church. Mm-hmm. If you have someone who's expressing doubts and if you know how that works.
Yeah, I mean, if you're married to someone who's not in the church, then all of the control that goes along with eternal families is already lost to you. So it's like, what else do you? All you have is the pressure to constantly put on that spouse to join.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I bless each of you to be a righteous leader in your family, community, church, and in this country. I so bless you and declare that God lives, Jesus is the Christ. This is his church. We're his people. I so testify with my expression of love and gratitude for each precious one of you. In the sacred name of Jesus Christ, amen.
I threw a few more commandments in there with that bless you stuff. So threw a couple more in there. I've never heard anyone go on that long with blessings that weren't really blessings. I think that one's new, at least for me noticing it.
There was one more element that I wanted to make sure that we covered in this. I'm trying to find where, millennials living in a hectic world. I want to cover this real quick. Let me move to Hangout, and I'm going to change screen share to application window. This one. Okay, so and I think, it's this part near the end here. Just listen to this real quick.
Don't forget we love you.
So at the end, he waves to them and he says, "Don't forget we love you." And it occurred to me when I saw that the concept of love is something which can very easily be turned against you. And that is when somebody comes to you and says, "I love you, and now I'm going to tell you something," you're automatically programmed to say, okay, well, they love me, so what they're going to tell me is for my own good. And it gives you this sense, well, they wouldn't, if they love me, they're not going to tell me something that hurts me or that is wrong for me or bad for me. And so it primes you to accept what they're going to say. Mm-hmm. And these constant reminders, anytime you get a visiting authority or a high council member, they're always going to convey the love of the whatever leader is right up there. And that just, it gives you this notion that you're being taken care of. And so you don't, if you then question what they say or question their motives or question anything, that's like, what, you're not thankful for the love that I'm showing you. And it's just one of those things that you want to be wary of, that it doesn't mean that if somebody tells you that they love you, that you should automatically distrust them. You just need to realize when you're listening to an authority or somebody who's telling you how to live your life, if they start flooding you with messages of how much they love you, that's a little bit of a red flag. Mm-hmm. If they love you, it should be apparent by how they interact with you in a way that validates your own experience and your own choices for yourself and your own decisions, rather than imposing their priorities on you, because that's not a loving thing if you're an independent adult who's able to make your own choices.
I found out the hard way that the way you can tell if someone loves you isn't by what they say. It has to be by what they do. And it took me to my late 30s, early 40s to learn that lesson. Because I was, again, referencing my abuser, that's why I learned it the hard way. He said he loved me, and I was looking at his words, not his actions.
Yeah, and that's a common pattern of abuse, is that the abuser will tell you that they love you. They'll remind you that they love you. They'll remind you that everything that they do is for you. But those are the words, whereas the actions themselves don't reflect that. Yeah.
And I think I might have learned that, from the church environment, because if you look at the way leadership acts, and again, I think local leadership, it's roulette as to how this works, but definitely the upper leadership, even the local leadership, they don't have time for you. They don't always know what your needs are and fulfill your, they're not able, whether through their own will or just their own ability, aren't able to love you through action. Again, local leaders, it's hit and miss. I think there's good examples on local leader level, but certainly Nelson,
it almost feels disingenuous for him to look out over, hundreds of people and say that he loves them, because there's a point at which using that phrase becomes almost an insult, because we know there cannot be that type of connection with a large group of people. There's a movie called Idiocracy, and somebody is, fallen asleep and gone till 500 years in the future or something, and Costco is turned into this huge conglomerate thing, and they go into the Costco, and there's a greeter at the door that says, "Welcome to Costco, I love you. Welcome to Costco, I love you." And it's just a reminder of how you could treat this expression of love as a commodity that's used as a manipulation just to try to ingratiate themselves into people. And I'm not saying that President Nelson doesn't have a sense of responsibility and duty and affection for members, just like somebody might say that. I remind myself that I'm primed to accept those statements and immediately accept anything that somebody says. And so I just need to step back and remind myself that it's okay to disagree with something that he might say. I don't have to automatically accept it just because he said he loved me.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. We've gone to the end of the talk. Yeah. Anyone that's kind of lasted this long, thanks for sticking with us. I'm going to go ahead and put the video of the talk itself so you can just listen to it without having to be interrupted by the commentary. It's only about 20 minutes or so, and feel free to comment on that or on this. And I'm told that I'm supposed to remind people to like and subscribe I'm told by my daughters who tell me, Dad, if you want to get video subscribers, you got to remind them to like and subscribe. So that's my daughter voice in my head. And I think that's it. Luna, thanks for joining me again for one of these. It ended a little bit longer than I thought, but that's how these things always go.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks a lot.
All right, take care.
Bye.